Exactly at 12 a.m., while I was standing pressed behind the second-floor curtain of my neighbor's house, the back door of my home opened. My daughter-in-law stepped out first, her hands trembling as she clutched a thick stack of papers. Behind her was a man I had never seen before, tall, wearing a dark coat, carrying an old leather briefcase. They didn't exchange money. They exchanged documents. Then the two of them quietly walked toward the shed where my husband had worked for 30 years. My heart began to race because they thought I was hundreds of miles away. But the truth was, I had never left this town. And in that moment, I understood. They weren't just betraying me. They were preparing to erase me from my own life. If you're still listening, tell me where you're watching from. Every comment you leave is another mark in this journey. And if this story has touched you, don't forget to hit like so it can reach even further. I had to grip the windowsill just to stay upright. My knees were shaking, not from the cold, but from a raw, primal fear rising from deep in my stomach. In the dim light spilling from the back porch, I could see Natalie's walk clearly. I had watched that walk for 8 years, since the day she entered my home in a pure white wedding dress, holding my son's hand. I knew every small movement she made, and I knew that when Natalie walked that slowly, shoulders slightly hunched, hands clenched tight against her chest, she was doing something she didn't want anyone to see. The man walking behind her sent a chill through me. Not because he looked dangerous. On the contrary, he looked completely ordinary. Too ordinary. Tall, thin, gray-haired, wearing a dark coat that was old but clean, and a leather briefcase worn at the handle, the kind I used to see carried by lawyers or bank employees back in the 1990s. That ordinariness was what terrified me, because it said one thing clearly. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't reckless. This was something carefully prepared. They stopped in front of the shed. That shed. God. My heart tightened when I saw that old wooden door. My husband, Harold, had built it with his own hands. For 30 years, every weekend he was in there, fixing the lawnmower, building wooden shelves, making small things for neighbors. It was where he escaped the world, where he turned on AM radio to listen to the morning news and drank strong black coffee. When Harold died, I kept the shed locked for almost a year. I couldn't bear to step inside it alone. And now Natalie was using that very place to meet a strange man at midnight with stacks of documents in her hands. I turned away and leaned my back against the cold wall of Howard's living room. Howard Klein, the neighbor who had lived across from me for more than 20 years. If it hadn't been for him, I don't know what would have happened to me that night. It was Howard who had told me in a low, unusually serious voice, "Lorraine, if you want the truth, you have to see it with your own eyes. Some things can't be explained." And he was right. Before standing here, trembling behind the curtain like a thief, I had still been trying to convince myself that maybe I was overthinking things, that maybe old age had made me more sensitive, that maybe Ethan and Natalie were just going through a difficult phase, and I, like so many other mothers, was exaggerating everything in my head. But the feeling that my home was no longer safe had been clinging to me for weeks. It didn't come from one big event, but from very small things. Things that, if I described them, people might laugh and say I was paranoid. But I had lived 63 years. I knew when a house began to change the way it breathed. Before, I woke up every morning at 6 a.m. I made coffee in an old glass pot, one Harold had bought years ago at Sears. Ethan usually came into the kitchen a few minutes after me, hair still messy, smiling and saying, "Morning, Mom." Natalie came down later, usually after 7 a.m., neat, lightly scented with perfume. We used to have quiet but comfortable breakfasts. Then everything changed. Ethan started coming down later. Some mornings I didn't see him until I had already finished cleaning up. Natalie began whispering to Ethan in the living room. Every time I walked in, the conversation stopped immediately. Ethan looked down at his phone. Natalie smiled, a smile so stiff it felt like a mask. I started noticing my son's eyes. He no longer looked straight at me the way he used to. He avoided my gaze, as if he were afraid I might read something there. And then there was the room, my old bedroom with Harold. After he passed, I had cleared it out, leaving only a few memory boxes and a wooden cabinet. That room had always been open, until one day I realized the door was locked. At first, I said nothing. I just stood there, my hand resting on the cold lock. A new lock, not the old one. "Oh, that room?" Natalie said when I asked. "We locked it because it's damp, Mom. We didn't want your things getting moldy." Her voice was too quick, too smooth, as if she had practiced the answer. I nodded, but inside, a cold stone dropped. Then there were the nights I heard noises. Not loud, not clear. Just soft footsteps, a door opening and closing. Some nights I heard the faint sound of a suitcase rolling across the wooden floor. When I stepped into the hallway, everything was silent, as if nothing had happened. I began to wonder if I was imagining things. That was why the idea of pretending to visit my sister came to me. It made me feel both ashamed and relieved. I hated lying to my son, but I hated even more the feeling of being pushed aside, treated like someone no longer clear-headed enough to understand what was happening in her own home. I told Ethan and Natalie I was going to Spokane to visit my sister for 1 week. I kept my voice casual. I even joked that I needed a change of scenery. Their reaction made my heart tighten. Ethan looked up too quickly. His eyes lit up for a split second. Then he caught himself. Natalie smiled. A wide, bright smile, far bigger than necessary. "That's wonderful, Mom," Natalie said. "You should take a little rest." Ethan nodded again and again. "Yeah, Mom. We'll take care of everything here." The way he said everything kept me awake all night. I packed my suitcase in front of them. I called my sister right there in the living room. I let them hear me talk about bus times, about how long I'd stay. I played the role of a slightly scatterbrained old mother so well that even I felt uncomfortable. Ethan insisted on driving me to the bus station. He wanted to be sure I left. I let him drive me. I hugged him. I looked into my son's eyes, the eyes I had looked into since the day he was born, and I saw no guilt, only urgency. I didn't get on the bus. I waited until Ethan left, then took a taxi back. Howard was already waiting. He didn't ask many questions. He just opened the door, led me upstairs, and pulled the curtain closed. "You need to see," he said again. And now I was seeing. Natalie and the man had gone into the shed. The door closed. A dim light turned on inside, shining through the dusty window. I saw shadows moving. I couldn't hear what they said, but I saw Natalie hand the stack of papers to the man. He flipped through each page, nodding slowly. That wasn't the scene of a cash exchange. That was the scene of an agreement. A naked fear squeezed my chest. Not fear of losing money, not fear of being used, but something deeper, darker. The fear of being erased, decided for, treated like a burden that needed to be handled. Howard stood behind me in silence. I knew he was seeing the same thing I was. The first night I watched my own house gave me my answer, and it was more horrifying than anything I had imagined. I stood there long after the light in the shed went out completely. Howard gently touched my shoulder, reminding me that I was still breathing, still standing in his quiet living room, not trapped in a nightmare. I nodded, pulled the curtain closed, and sat down in the old armchair. My hands were ice cold, but my mind was burning. Dozens of questions flooded in, none fully answered. I knew only one thing. What I had just seen could not be separated from my past, from that house, from the life I had spent decades building. Harold and I met when we were very young. I was just in my early 20s, working part-time at a small-town library. Harold was an electrician, always smelling faintly of metal and machine oil. He didn't talk much, but every word was solid. We weren't rich, we never were, but we knew we were building something lasting. When we bought the land, it was just an empty lot, patchy grass, wind blowing straight through. Harold held my hand, pointed ahead, and said, "This will be our home." The house was built little by little. There were summers when we lived in a half-finished place, eating dinner at a temporary wooden table, surrounded by the smell of paint and insects. I remember every detail. The staircase Harold built himself, the third step that creaked slightly, the living room window frame set a bit crooked because it rained hard that day, the back porch where we drank tea every afternoon. 40 years passed, and that house became more than shelter. It was a witness to every stage of my life, from giving birth to Ethan, sleepless nights holding a baby, to quiet evenings when my husband and I had grown used to silence. When Harold died, it felt as if the house lost its voice. He was gone after a stroke, so fast I had no time to prepare. One morning, he was in the shed fixing an old radio. By evening, he was gone. I lived in that house like a shadow for almost 2 years. I didn't clean the shed. I didn't touch his clothes in the closet. I just moved through familiar rooms, trying not to touch the empty spaces. It was during that time that Ethan began staying over more often. At first, a few nights a week. Then gradually, he said he and Natalie wanted to move in with me. Ethan said I shouldn't live alone anymore. Natalie said the house was big enough that 3 people would make it warmer. I remember that night clearly, sitting across from me at the dining table, warm yellow light overhead, voices soft and caring. I looked at my son and saw the boy I once walked to school, the child I sheltered from rain. I didn't think of calculation. I had one simple thought: family should be together. At first, it truly was peaceful. Natalie woke up early to make breakfast. She always asked what I wanted to eat or drink. Sometimes she baked apple pie and placed it in front of me, saying it was her mother's recipe, but she wanted me to try it first. Ethan fixed the fence, replaced light bulbs, painted the north wall Harold had planned to do but never finished. When I spoke about my husband, Ethan listened closely. Natalie nodded, placed her hand over mine in shared sympathy. I believed them, completely. Some evenings, the 3 of us sat watching television, talking about nothing important. I told Natalie old stories about the house, every corner, every memory. She listened, asked questions, remembered. I felt relieved thinking the house wouldn't be abandoned, that it still had laughter and warmth. I even thought maybe this was how Harold stayed with me, through our son and his small family. But the warmth slowly changed, so gradually I didn't notice at first. There were no arguments, no harsh words, just tiny shifts. Natalie started rearranging things without asking. Familiar items were moved. Once I couldn't find the wooden box Harold made for me. Natalie said she'd put it in storage to keep the house tidy. I nodded but felt a quiet loss. Ethan was home less in the evenings. He said work was busy. When he was home, he sat on his phone replying quickly, then putting it away when I walked in. I didn't ask. I thought I should respect his privacy. Natalie stayed gentle, but her smile was no longer natural. She cared for me in a very proper, very correct way. So correct that sometimes I felt less like a mother and more like someone being managed. I still believed, because I didn't want to think otherwise. That may have been my greatest mistake. I didn't realize that, little by little, I was being pushed to the edge of my own home. No one said it outright. No one told me to stay out of the way or be quiet. But small decisions were made without me. Conversations happened when I wasn't there. Doors closed softly behind my back. I had opened the first door to all of this with trust, a mother's trust, that her child would never harm her. That care was genuine, not a disguise. Sitting in Howard's living room that night, I saw it clearly. That 40-year-old house wasn't just being used for something I didn't understand. It had become the stage for a play where I, the true owner, had been written out of the leading role long ago. After that night, I could no longer go back to being someone who didn't know, even though I still didn't see the whole picture. I sat quietly in Howard's living room, listening to the steady ticking of the wall clock, like a borrowed heartbeat. Outside, the night wind moved through bare maple trees, brushing against the glass. I told myself to stay calm, that what I'd seen might only be part of something. But the more I tried to reassure myself, the more I remembered the small signs that had been there all along, like tiny cracks in a glass cup I had pretended not to see. I remembered the first time conversation stopped when I appeared. It was a Sunday afternoon, light rain falling, the kind that covers a town in gray mist. I had just come back from church, still holding the service program. When I walked into the living room, I heard Ethan and Natalie talking. Low voices, urgent. I caught only a few scattered words like paperwork, an appointment, and then silence. Natalie turned, smiling far too brightly, asking if I wanted tea. Ethan bent down to tie his shoes, as if he'd dropped something. I stood there for a few seconds, feeling like I'd stepped into a room everyone wanted to lock before I entered. After that, the pattern repeated. I stepped into the kitchen. Whispers vanished. I walked into the hallway. The topic changed to weather or food. What frightened me wasn't the silence, but the coordination, as if they'd practiced, as if there was an unspoken rule. When Mom's here, don't talk. The phone, too. I wasn't the type to snoop. I even found it a little funny how younger people glued themselves to screens. But Ethan, he was my son. I knew his breathing, his expressions when he was worried, happy, or hiding something. Some mornings, he sat at the breakfast table scrolling fast. When I walked in, he flipped the screen down or shoved it into his pocket, reflexively. If it were work, he wouldn't need to hide it. If it were personal, he wouldn't react. Like that. That hurried motion looked like someone caught doing something wrong. I asked casually once, keeping my voice light. "Is something going on, Ethan?" He looked at me, smiled faintly, said, "Nothing, Mom. Just small stuff." But his eyes wouldn't settle. He looked past me, down at the table, out the window, anywhere but at my face. That avoidance kept me awake at night. I had given birth to him, held him through fevers, watched him learn to walk and write. I knew how clear those eyes once were, and now they looked at me like I was an inconvenience, like I was in the way, not a mother. And then, the storage room. My old bedroom with Harold, the room I'd turned into a place for memories, suddenly became forbidden. The door wasn't just closed, it was locked. A new lock, shiny and cold under my fingers. I remember the feel of that metal, like touching an invisible boundary that had just been built inside my own home. When I asked, Natalie answered too quickly, "That room's damp, Mom. I was worried your boxes might get moldy." The explanation sounded reasonable, on paper. But words, no matter how polished, still have a smell. With Natalie, it smelled like haste. She wasn't speaking like someone concerned. She was blocking a door. I tried to be reasonable. I told myself maybe the room really was damp. Maybe I'd overlooked something. But the more I thought, the less sense it made. I had lived in that house for 40 years. I knew which corners were damp, which stayed dry. I knew where the winter wind came from. I even remembered replacing the double pane windows last year to prevent condensation. And most of all, if they truly cared about my things, they would have talked to me first, asked what I wanted. They had no right to lock part of my house, let alone change the lock. Once at noon, when Natalie was out shopping, I tried opening the door with my keys. None fit. I stood there, listening to the useless clinking, then let my hand fall. My heart pounded, not with anger, but with the quiet realization of being stripped of authority. As if no one needed to hit you or yell, changing a lock was enough to say, "You're no longer in charge here." The nights that followed became a stretch of nights when I slept without truly sleeping. I lay in my room with the bedside lamp dimly lit, listening to the sounds of the house the way people listen to breaking news. There was the soft creak of the wooden floor in the hallway, the sound of a door opening and then closing. Some nights, close to 11 p.m., I heard a very distinct sound, the rolling of suitcase wheels across the floor, very light, as if someone deliberately lifted it whenever they passed over a spot that might creak. I sat upright, my heart pounding, listening. Part of me wanted to step out immediately, turn on the lights and confront them. But another part, the part that had lived long enough to understand how cruel people can become when they are cornered, held me back. I was afraid I would step out and be met with that look of pity, the kind people reserve for an old woman who imagines things. I was afraid Natalie would smile gently and say, "You must have heard wrong, Mom." I was afraid Ethan would sigh as if I were bothering them, and most frightening of all, I was afraid they would know I was paying attention. So I stayed still. I blamed myself. I scolded myself for becoming suspicious because of my age, for reading too many stories online about ugly family situations. I told myself that the suitcase sound was probably just Natalie rearranging things, that the footsteps were probably Ethan going to the kitchen for water, but every time I tried to explain it away, a very clear feeling surfaced, one I could not silence. A mother's instinct. That instinct doesn't speak in words. It feels like a stone sitting in your stomach, cold and heavy. It makes you look at a smile and sense something beneath it. It makes you hear the words, "I'm fine," and know with certainty that things are not fine. With Ethan, I had felt that instinct when he was a child. Just hearing his breathing was enough for me to know he was about to get a fever. I trusted that instinct more than any doctor's words, and now that instinct was screaming that something was seriously wrong. I began to observe every detail carefully, but I did it the way a woman does who has learned that silence can be a form of survival. I stopped questioning. I stopped asking, "What are you two talking about?" I simply listened and remembered. I started noticing what time Ethan came home. I noticed when Natalie muted her phone. I noticed the days they seemed especially eager to send me to bed early. I even noticed the smell in the house, the frequent presence of new cleaning products, as if they were trying to erase traces of something. Some mornings I saw the outdoor trash bin much fuller than usual, as if a large amount of paper had been thrown away. Other days I watched Natalie carry a large bag out to the garage, walking quickly, her shoulders tense. I heard the rustling sound of paper envelopes. I didn't know what was inside, but I knew one thing. Important things were being moved, stored away, hidden. I began to feel like I was living in my own home as a guest. No one told me to leave. No one said anything cruel. But each small sign, the conversations cut short, the disappearing phone, the avoiding eyes, the new lock, the suitcase sounds at night, was enough to slowly kill my trust. Trust doesn't collapse from a single blow. It dies from hundreds of needle pricks. And when trust dies, the truth becomes sharp as a blade. Tonight, after seeing Natalie meet a strange man with documents in the shed, all those small fragments suddenly fit together into a picture I didn't want to see. I didn't dare say it out loud because even admitting it made my throat tighten. I looked out the window once, more, even though I knew the light was off, even though I knew I would see only darkness and still trees. Howard stood beside me, his voice low. "You see now, Lorraine. You weren't imagining it." I nodded slightly, because from that moment on, I understood I had crossed a line. I was no longer just a mother hoping for peace in old age. I had become a woman who had to protect herself, with wide open eyes, a sharp memory, and a cold patience I never thought I possessed. I didn't take my eyes off my house for the rest of that night. After the light in the shed finally went out, Natalie returned to the house through the back door, her steps quicker than when she left, as if she wanted to erase her own tracks. The door closed very softly, almost without a sound. Then everything sank into silence. Silence so deep I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I thought it might have been a one-time thing, that somehow, in a way I didn't yet understand, it would end there. But my instinct, the same instinct that had robbed me of sleep for weeks, would not allow that hope. I stayed there behind the thin curtain, waiting, like a night watchman guarding my own home. And then I saw them. Close to 10 p.m. the next night, a gray sedan pulled up in front of my house. The headlights turned off immediately. 2 people stepped out, a young woman and a man in his 40s. They didn't speak loudly. The woman pulled a medium-sized suitcase, its wheels rolling over the stone walkway. The man wore a backpack, the straps pulled tight across his chest. I recognized that kind of luggage immediately, not for a short dinner visit, but for an overnight stay. Natalie opened the door before they even rang the bell. That sight made my stomach tighten, not because it was unexpected, but because of how smoothly it happened. No hesitation, no questions. Natalie smiled, tilted her head, greeting them like a host accustomed to guests. They exchanged a few brief words. I couldn't hear them, but I saw the gesture clearly. The man pulled out his wallet, took out a few neatly folded bills, and placed them in Natalie's hand. She didn't count them. She simply nodded and stepped aside, signaling them to enter. Cash. In that moment, all doubt inside me turned into something heavy and undeniable. This wasn't paperwork. It wasn't a personal connection. It wasn't a casual visit. It was cash. And Natalie accepted it with a practiced motion. Howard stood beside me, breathing quietly. I didn't turn to look at him, but I knew he was seeing the same thing. The suitcase was pulled into the house. The door closed. The living room curtain shifted slightly, then went still. A while later, I saw the light come on in the upstairs hallway. Then the light from the locked room inside the house, not the shed, the room that had once been my bedroom. I covered my mouth with my hand, not because I was about to cry, but because if I didn't, I was afraid I might scream. I had lived in that room for nearly 30 years. I knew how the light spilled from the window when the lamp was on. I knew the position of the fixture, the angle of its glow. There was no mistaking it. Strangers had been led into the room I no longer had a key to. The room that held the last things Harold left me. the room I believed I was protecting by never entering it again. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I returned home before Ethan and Natalie woke up. Howard offered to come with me, but I shook my head. I needed to feel the house with my own body. I needed to see what everything looked like when daylight erased the shadows of the night before. Everything was perfect. The living room was tidy. The kitchen was spotless. The smell of freshly brewed coffee drifted through the air. Natalie stood by the stove, her hair neatly tied back, wearing a light-colored sweater. She turned and smiled at me gently, just like every other day. "Good morning, Mom. Did you sleep well?" The question made my throat go dry. I nodded and answered in a voice that surprised even me with how calm it sounded. Ethan came down the stairs, adjusting his sleeves, greeting me as if nothing had happened. No sign of unease, no tension, nothing at all. The strangers were gone. No suitcase, no backpack, no noise. The locked room sat silent, as if no one had ever stepped inside. I sat at the table, took a sip of coffee, felt the familiar bitterness spread across my tongue, and realized a cold truth. They were very good. So good that if I hadn't seen the night before with my own eyes, I would have believed everything was my imagination. Ethan talked about his work for the day. Natalie asked if I needed anything from the grocery store. They played their roles perfectly, frighteningly so. I looked at my son, the child I once believed could never lie, and understood this. They weren't hiding just one thing from me. They were living two lives under the same roof. I went back to Howard's house that night, and that night I saw them again. This time it was a different couple, a younger man with a large backpack and a blonde woman pulling a small suitcase. Natalie greeted them at the back door. Again, cash. Again, the nod. Again, the locked room. The nights that followed blurred together into an endless chain. Strangers arrived. Luggage went inside. Money changed hands. Lights turned on and off. And every morning, everything returned to normal with chilling perfection. Ethan remained the dutiful son, asking if I wanted him to fix the loose stair step. Natalie remained the attentive daughter-in-law, folding towels, wiping counters, asking about my health. I understood they were acting, and I understood that if I shattered that performance now, I would be the one who lost. Confront them? I had thought about it, many times. There were moments watching Natalie take the money when I wanted to run out of Howard's house, cross the street, pound on the door and ask, "What are you doing in my home?" But I stopped myself, not because I was weak, but because I was clear-headed enough to understand the danger. If I confronted them without proof, they would deny everything. They would say, "I heard wrong, saw wrong." They would use soft voices and concerned looks to turn me into a delusional old woman. And if what they were doing was bigger than what I had seen, if behind those rented rooms there was something more, then revealing my suspicion could make them change their plan, or worse, speed it up. I needed evidence. Not one piece, not one night, but a chain that couldn't be denied. I needed to know how long they had been doing this, how many people were involved, and how they were using my house. I needed to understand the entire play before pulling back the curtain. And so, I chose silence. Silence wasn't weakness. Silence was strategy. I began memorizing times, memorizing faces, memorizing car colors, suitcase sizes, the way strangers walked. I remembered how Natalie always took the money with her left hand. I remembered that Ethan was never present when the money changed hands, but always appeared calm the next morning. Every sleepless night brought me closer to the truth. I was no longer a woman sitting in the kitchen waiting for her children's care. I became an observer, quiet, patient. I knew I was stepping into dangerous territory, but I also knew one thing. That 40-year-old house, my life, and the honor of my late husband could not be sold off in silence, and I would not allow it. I stood by Howard's window long after the last car left that night. Streetlights cast a dull yellow glow onto the wet pavement. My house, seen from across the street, looked brutally peaceful. Howard pulled a chair closer and placed a cup of hot tea in front of me. He didn't speak right away. Neither did I. Some truths need to be spoken slowly, or they knock you to the ground. After a while, Howard finally spoke. His voice was rough and slow, as if each word had been carefully weighed. "Lorraine, I've actually been noticing this for weeks." I turned to him. The warm light in the living room made Howard look older than usual. The wrinkles around his eyes seemed deeper, not from age, but from worry held in too long. I wasn't surprised to hear him say that. I just wasn't ready for how clear the truth had become. Howard said that at first he thought he was just too idle, a widower living alone, spending more time at the window than necessary. He noticed cars parking in front of my house at night, then brushed it off. Probably friends of the kids, he thought, or someone stopping by late. But the cars kept coming, always after 9 p.m., often around 10 p.m., sometimes later. What made him suspicious was the pattern. Never during the day, never loud laughter or bright lights like normal gatherings. Everything was quiet, discreet, as if someone didn't want to be seen. And the people stepping out of the cars were never the same. Howard said he remembered clearly. Some nights it was a young couple pulling 2 large suitcases. Other nights it was a middle-aged man with a backpack. Sometimes 2 women speaking in accents that didn't sound local. But no matter who they were, they all had one thing in common: luggage. Always luggage. Not small handbags, not gifts, but what people bring when they plan to stay overnight. I started wondering, Howard said slowly, why people would come to your house at that hour with luggage like that and then disappear by morning. He looked at me, as if checking that I was still listening. I nodded, my throat burning. I had seen it myself, but hearing someone else confirm it still felt like a hammer striking my head. Howard admitted there were many nights he had stood exactly where I was standing now, looking through the curtain, watching Natalie open the door before guests even rang, watching her smile and usher them in, watching suitcases roll up the path, watching the door close quickly. "Your daughter-in-law," he said without malice, only truth, was always the one greeting them. I never saw Ethan do it. That matched everything I had observed. Natalie was the one in control. Natalie set the rhythm. Ethan stayed in the background. That division of roles sent a chill through me. It showed this wasn't impulsive, it was intentional. Howard said he had wrestled with himself for weeks. He didn't want to interfere in someone else's family. He was afraid of being seen as idle or suspicious. "You know," he said softly, "at our age, it's easy to be labeled as imagining things. I didn't want to worry you unless I was sure." I understood that better than anyone. I had labeled myself that way just to keep living in false peace. But then one night, Howard paused, took a sip of tea, as if steadying himself. He said that night was colder than usual. He was awake with insomnia, and he saw something that erased all doubt. Natalie opened the door, as usual. A man stepped in, pulling a suitcase. But before going inside, the man stopped and pulled out his wallet. Howard saw clearly because the porch light was on. Bills were taken out, folded, and placed in Natalie's hand. She took them, quickly tucked them into her coat pocket, and led the guest inside. There was no more doubt after that, Howard said. No one hands over cash like that just to visit friends. When he said that, I closed my eyes for a moment. I didn't need him to continue, but he did, because some truths need to be spoken to be undeniable. He said that from that moment on, he knew my house had been turned into something else. No longer a family home, but a place of transactions, a place of exchange, an illegal boarding house operating in silence. I opened my eyes. I wasn't as shocked as I expected. There was no spinning, no collapse. Instead, there was a strange stillness, as if part of me had known this answer for a long time and simply hadn't dared to name it. "Thank you," I said, my voice hoarse but steady. "Thank you for telling me." Howard shook his head. "I'm sorry I didn't say something sooner." I looked at him and saw not curiosity or judgment in his eyes, but the guilt of a good neighbor. I knew he owed me nothing. I, too, had chosen silence for too long. When Howard said the words, "illegal boarding house," it didn't surprise me. It only completed the picture. The sleepless nights, the suitcases, the cash, the locked room, everything fit together in a terrifying way. I thought of Harold's room, of his belongings being touched and used by strangers who didn't know who they belonged to. A sharp pain pierced my chest, but it didn't break me. It sharpened me. I told Howard I wasn't surprised. He looked at me, slightly startled. I gave a sad smile. "I felt it for a long time," I said. "I just didn't want to believe it." We sat there in the small living room, listening to the night. No one spoke for a while, but in my mind another thought, heavier than the rest, began to take shape. If they dared to turn my home into an illegal rental, if they dared to take cash from strangers under my roof, then what else was happening that I hadn't seen yet? I had seen enough to know this wasn't something small. But deep down, I also knew that the nights of renting out rooms were only the surface. There was something behind those stacks of papers I saw in the shed, something tied to the urgency, to the way Natalie controlled everything, to the way Ethan avoided my eyes. I looked at my house again through the window. It stood there, silent, like a mute witness to everything happening inside. I wasn't shocked to learn it had been turned into an illegal boarding house. I had prepared myself for that truth, even if I didn't want it. But I also understood something that weighed even heavier on my heart. When people are willing to do something that wrong, they rarely stop there. I knew, very clearly, that something worse was waiting ahead. And I also knew that from this moment on, I had no choice but to face it, even if the cost might be everything I had ever trusted. The next morning, when the sunlight just brushed the edge of the kitchen windowsill, I knew it was time to take another step, not a step back, a step into a different role. I sat at the dining table, my hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, trying to keep my voice as normal as possible when I said the sentence I had prepared all night. "I think I'll go visit my sister for a week." The words dropped into the quiet space like a small stone tossed into a still lake. Ethan looked up first. Natalie stopped folding towels. In a very brief moment, so brief that if I hadn't been watching them closely, I would have missed it, I saw something flicker. Not worry, not surprise, but relief, almost happiness. "Really, Mom?" Natalie asked, her voice slightly higher than usual. "Is she doing well?" I nodded. "She is. She's called a few times already, saying it's been too long since we last saw each other." Ethan set his coffee cup down and smiled at me. "You should go. A change of scenery would be good. Staying home all the time gets boring. Boring. The words sounded so light, as if this house were no longer a place that belonged to me. I watched them more closely as we talked. Natalie asked how many days I would be gone, how I was traveling, whether she should prepare food in advance. Ethan nodded repeatedly, occasionally adding things like, "You deserve a rest," or "We'll take care of the house." Every word was polite, perfectly appropriate. But that very perfection made my skin crawl. There was no hesitation, no questions like, "Are you okay traveling alone?" or "Should I go with you?" They wanted me to go, and they didn't hide it well enough. That afternoon, I took my old suitcase out of the closet. The brown one worn at the corners, the one Harold and I used for long trips. I placed it in the middle of the living room, opened it, and began packing. I did it slowly, deliberately. I wanted them to see. I wanted every shirt, every pair of socks placed inside the suitcase to say clearly, I am about to leave. Natalie walked past a few times, always wearing that gentle smile. "Don't pack too much, Mom. It's just a week." She spoke like a caring daughter-in-law. Ethan brought me a jacket, saying the evenings at my sister's place might be colder. I took it, thanked him, and kept packing. Inside, something ached. Not because they were helping me, but because they were helping too quickly, too eagerly, as if they were politely pushing me toward the door. That evening, I picked up my phone and called my sister. In truth, I called the voicemail of an old number I knew no one answered anymore. I spoke loudly enough for them to hear. I laughed, asked how she was doing, said I would be leaving in the morning, said I missed her. I even pretended to debate which jacket I should bring. Natalie stood in the kitchen, Ethan in the living room. They listened, and I knew that in their minds, everything was going exactly according to plan. The next morning, Ethan offered to drive me to the bus station. "I'll take you. It's easier that way," he said, sounding relieved. I nodded, pretended to hesitate for a moment, then agreed. Natalie helped carry my suitcase to the car. She hugged me, patted my back, and said, "Have a safe trip." That hug had no warmth. It felt like a ritual. On the way to the station, Ethan talked about small things, work, the weather, traffic. I watched my son through the rearview mirror. He focused on driving, occasionally glancing at me. There was nothing that looked like concern from a son seeing his mother off. Only carefully hidden impatience. At the station, Ethan parked and took my suitcase out for me. He stood there and hugged me again. "Call me when you arrive," he said. I looked into his eyes. For a brief second, I wondered if he felt any guilt. Then he turned away, as if he couldn't stand my gaze for too long. "Of course," I said. I walked into the station, pulling my suitcase behind me. I passed the ticket gate. I didn't look back. I knew that if I did, I would see Ethan standing there, waiting for me to board, not out of worry, but to make sure I truly left. I sat on a bench, watching the bus prepare to depart. Once Ethan had been gone long enough, I stood up, pulled my suitcase toward the back exit of the station. I didn't get on the bus. I went outside, flagged down a small taxi, and gave the address I had known by heart for many years, Howard's house. When the taxi stopped at the gate, Howard was already waiting. He looked at me with an expression that held both concern and resolve. I pulled my suitcase inside, closed the door, and in that moment I felt as though I had crossed a line I could never return from. I was no longer a passive mother waiting to see what her children would do next. I had chosen to stand on the other side, the side of the truth. From the upstairs room in Howard's house, I could clearly see the front door of my own home. I set the suitcase down without opening it. I didn't need my belongings. I needed my eyes and my memory. That evening, as night fell, I saw Natalie open the door. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. Strangers arrived. Luggage went inside. Money changed hands. Everything happened faster, more naturally than on previous nights, as if they were certain I was truly gone. Their caution disappeared, replaced by the ease of people who believed no one was watching. I stood there, memorizing every detail, the timing, the number of people, the type of luggage, the way Natalie held the money, the way Ethan appeared afterward, calm, as if he had just come home from a normal work day. I didn't write anything down. I stored it in my mind. I knew my memory was still very good, better than they thought. The second night, the third night, I stayed there. I became a witness to my own home. Each night I saw another piece of the picture, and each piece made me more certain that what they were doing wasn't just about money. In that silence, I began preparing my counterattack, not with rage, not with a sudden confrontation, but with cold patience. I needed to understand the entire play before pulling back the curtain. I needed to know how far they had gone and how much farther they planned to go. I didn't sleep much, but I wasn't tired. There is a kind of clarity that appears only when you know you are standing at a major turning point. I felt it clearly with every breath. I had left the house, in name only. In reality, I was coming back stronger than ever. On the third night after I had left town, I began to see the entire picture that had previously appeared only in fragments. My house was no longer operating like a family home. It had shifted into a different rhythm, cold and precise, like a machine that had been carefully oiled. Couples arrived so regularly that I could predict it. Usually after 7 p.m., when the sky began to darken and the surrounding houses turned on their lights, the first car appeared. Some nights it was a black SUV, other nights a silver sedan, sometimes a rental car with company stickers still on it. No one stayed more than one night. No one came back a second time. But the common thread never changed. They always brought luggage, and they always arrived with the cautious air of people who didn't want to be recognized. Natalie greeted them like someone completely accustomed to it. She didn't need to check her phone or look at the clock. She knew exactly when they would arrive. The door opened before the bell rang. I saw her smile, not a polite smile, but the smile of someone in control. She tilted her head, said a few brief words, then held out her hand. Cash was placed into her palm. No receipts, no questions, just smooth, unspoken understanding. I had never imagined Natalie could do this so skillfully. She led the guests inside, guided them up the stairs, opened the door to the room I had once called the safest place of my life. I saw the light turn on inside, spilling through the window exactly as I remembered. But now it illuminated unfamiliar faces. They set their suitcases down on the floor, sat on the bed where I had once lain beside Harold, where I had held his hand through long nights of illness. Ethan appeared later. He was never there when the money was exchanged. He always came home like a normal husband, a normal son, taking off his jacket, hanging it up, stepping into the kitchen. But then he did small things, very small things, that made his role clear. He carried extra towels upstairs. He checked the water heater. He reminded Natalie to lock the back door. Everything happened quietly, in sync, without a word needing to be explained. One night, I saw Ethan standing in the upstairs hallway speaking to a pair of guests. He smiled, nodded, pointed toward the bathroom. That gesture made my chest tighten. That was my son, playing the role of a hotel employee in the house I had spent my entire life building. I began to count, not because I cared about the money, but because I needed to understand the scale of this betrayal. For each couple, I saw Natalie take about $50 to $60. Some nights there was one couple, some nights two. On weekends, more. 3, even 4 groups. I calculated silently, number by number, the way one counts heartbeats when they know something is wrong. In a single weekend night, they could make more than $200. In a week, close to $1,000. In a month, the number jumped to a level I didn't want to think about. Thousands of dollars. Money, earned by using my house, my utilities, and worse, by violating my most sacred memories. Every time the bedroom light came on, I thought of Harold. I remembered the way he used to place a book on his chest when he dozed off. I remembered the steady sound of his breathing in the quiet night. And now, those sounds were replaced. Suitcase wheels, hushed voices, doors closing. It felt like someone was walking muddy shoes across a carpet I had spent my life protecting. The pain didn't come all at once. It accumulated. It settled in layers like dust on furniture. And then, without my noticing when it happened, that pain transformed into anger. Not loud anger, but cold anger. The kind that made my hands shake as I gripped the window railing. The kind that forced me to bite my lip to keep from bursting out of Howard's house, crossing the street, and pounding on my own front door. There were moments when I stood up abruptly. I turned, ready to go down the stairs. In my mind, I saw myself standing in the living room, looking straight at Natalie and Ethan, asking a single question. "What do you think you're doing in my house?" I imagined their faces when exposed, the panic, the confusion, maybe even pleading. Then Howard placed his hand on my arm. "Don't," he said quietly, but firmly. I turned to him, my eyes burning with anger. "They're humiliating me in my own home," I whispered. "I can't just stand by and watch." Howard shook his head slowly. "I know, but you have to look carefully. If you confront them now, they'll deny it. They'll say it's just a few friends. They'll twist the story until you're the one who seems overly sensitive. And if they're doing this, there's a good chance they're doing something else too." That last sentence stopped me cold. I looked back at the house. Natalie stood in the kitchen, laughing with a newly arrived couple. Ethan carried extra blankets upstairs. Everything ran smoothly, like a system that had been operating for a long time. Howard was right. This wasn't the moment to explode. This was the moment to observe, to remember, to accumulate. I needed to know how far they had gone. I needed to know whether what I was seeing was the bottom or just the surface of something darker. I sat back down and took a deep breath. The anger was still there, burning in my chest, but I forced it to settle, turning it into something else, sharp focus. I told myself every night they hosted guests was a night they left traces. Every dollar they took was evidence, and every memory violated was a reason I could not afford to soften. My house had been turned into a secret hotel, but I hadn't lost it. Not yet. I was still here. I could still see, and I could still remember. I thought I had already seen the worst. I believed that turning my home into a secret hotel, making money from rooms filled with memories, was the lowest point of betrayal. But I was wrong. Some truths don't reveal themselves on their own. They wait to be spoken at the right moment by someone brave enough to break the silence. Howard told me that story on a gray afternoon, with light rain falling on the porch outside. We sat in the kitchen, each holding a cup of tea that had gone cold without either of us noticing. I was still thinking about the night before, about the last pair of guests leaving my house near dawn, when Howard cleared his throat. There was something heavier than usual in the sound. "Lorraine," he said slowly. "There's something I haven't told you." I looked up. In his eyes, I saw the hesitation of someone who had kept something hidden for too long. My instinct, once again, began pounding in my chest. Howard said that about 2 weeks earlier, before things were as obvious as they were now, he'd been sitting at the small cafe near the post office. It was a place he went every Thursday morning, ordered a cup of black coffee, and read the newspaper. That day, he hadn't been paying much attention until he saw Natalie walk in. Natalie wasn't alone. She sat down across from a man Howard had never seen in town. The man looked to be around 50 years old, neatly dressed, wearing a dark jacket, his hair carefully combed. Most important of all, he carried a thick briefcase, the kind people don't bring just to have a casual coffee. Howard hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the cafe was small, and they weren't speaking very quietly. At first, he heard scattered words that didn't seem alarming. Paperwork, procedures, timing. Then he heard words that made him lower his newspaper. Legal capacity. Howard repeated the phrase to me slowly, as if he himself didn't want to believe what he had heard. I felt a chill run down my back. He said Natalie leaned toward the man, lowered her voice, and mentioned something about a mental evaluation. The man nodded, opened the briefcase, and pointed to several pages. Then Howard heard another phrase, one that nearly stopped my heart when he repeated it. Nursing home. I don't remember how I reacted in the seconds that followed. I only remember the cold spreading along my spine, as if someone had poured ice water over me. Those words weren't random. They don't appear in casual conversation. They are the language of law, of planning, of calculation. Howard said he sat there, heart racing, afraid to turn his head and look directly at them. He worried that if they realized he was paying attention, the conversation would stop. But he heard enough to know Natalie wasn't talking about anyone else. She was talking about me. She needs to be evaluated. Howard recalled Natalie's voice, calm, without emotion. Just to be sure. She's not young anymore. Howard didn't hear every detail, but he heard enough to know it wasn't an innocent conversation. When Natalie stood up, the man closed the briefcase, nodded, and they left the cafe, together. Howard sat there for a long time afterward, unable to take another sip of his coffee. I didn't know what to do, Howard said, his voice rough. I was afraid I'd heard wrong, and I was afraid if I said something without being sure, I'd scare you. I didn't blame him. Because if I had heard that story from someone else, I might have asked myself the same question. Was I imagining things? But now, with all the pieces laid side by side, the locked rooms, the papers I saw at night, the way they pushed me out of the house, everything became brutally clear. The house wasn't just a source of income, it was the target. And I was the obstacle. My throat went dry. Are you sure? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Howard nodded. I'm sure I can't forget those words. That very night, I called Rebecca. Rebecca is my lawyer and also an old friend from when I worked at the city library. Her voice on the other end of the line was as calm as ever, but when I told her what Howard had overheard, I sensed a very slight change in her breathing. Lorraine, Rebecca said after a brief silence, if they're discussing legal capacity and a mental evaluation, this is more serious than you think. She explained it to me, without rushing, without trying to scare me, but every word felt like a knife cutting through my last remaining illusion. At my age, all it takes is one unfavorable medical evaluation, even one that's manipulated or misinterpreted, and a court can consider appointing a legal guardian. And if that guardian is Ethan, Your assets, Rebecca said plainly, could be legally controlled. The house, the bank accounts, medical decisions, everything. I gripped the phone tightly. But I'm completely clear-minded, I said, my voice shaking. I'm not incompetent. I know, Rebecca replied, and that's exactly why you have to act early. Because if they move first, if they build a file, prepare paperwork, create evidence, then you'll be the one who has to prove you're competent instead of them having to prove you're not. That sentence made the full danger crystal clear. This wasn't a sneaky money-making scheme anymore. This was a reversal of power. Once the legal wheels start turning, they don't stop easily. Natalie is very smart, Rebecca continued. And if she's working with someone who understands the law, someone carrying a briefcase, then they're not thinking about just a few $1,000s in room rentals. I sat silently, listening to the rain hit the window. In my mind, the image of Natalie taking cash from guests suddenly seemed small, almost trivial. That was only the first step, a way to generate money, a way to prove they were managing the house effectively, a way to prepare for something much bigger. They want my life, I said quietly, almost to myself. Rebecca didn't deny it. Yes, she said. They want control of everything, legally. When the call ended, I sat there for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. There was only a deep stillness like a frozen lake. I thought of Ethan, the son I had raised, trusted completely. I thought of Natalie, the woman who had entered my family with a gentle smile. And I realized the most painful part wasn't that they wanted money. It wasn't that they were violating my home. The most painful part was that they had planned to erase me from my own life through legal, cold, methodical means, without leaving any visible trace of cruelty on the surface. I stood up and walked to the window, looking toward my house. The lights were still on. Normal life was still going on inside, but I knew that from this moment on, I couldn't hesitate anymore. Because once people start talking about legal capacity and nursing homes, it's no longer a family matter. It's a fight for the right to exist as yourself. I didn't sleep at all that night. Not because I was afraid, but because my mind was painfully clear. Rebecca's words echoed over and over, each sentence like a cold stone dropping onto an already frozen lake. If they moved first, if they prepared enough paperwork and enough evidence, I would be pushed into a position where I had to prove I was still myself. That thought made it impossible for me to sit still another day. The next morning, when Ethan left early for work and Natalie drove out to go shopping, Howard looked at me and, with just a nod, understood what I was about to do. I didn't say it out loud, but we both knew. It was time for me to face the place they believed I would never dare to touch, the shed behind the yard, the place where Harold had spent the last decades of his life fixing small things, building bookshelves for me, and storing tools he could never bring himself to throw away. I walked across the grass, still wet with dew, my heart beating hard but steady. The shed key was still on my old key ring. At least that gave me a small sense that they hadn't managed to replace everything yet. The door opened with its familiar creak. The smell of old wood and machine oil filled my nose, carrying a warmth of memory I didn't have time to indulge. Dim light filtered through the small window, just enough for me to see the old wooden shelves, Harold's workbench, and something that did not belong there at all. A gray metal safe, placed neatly under the table. I froze for a few seconds. My heart pounded harder, not from surprise, but from the cold confirmation of suspicions that had clung to me for weeks. I stepped closer and bent down. The safe wasn't locked. Maybe they were in a hurry, or maybe they were too confident that no one else would come in here. I opened the safe. Inside was cash, more than I expected. Bundles of bills neatly tied with rubber bands in various denominations. I didn't count carefully, but a single glance was enough to know it represented many nights, many weeks, money earned from my house, my room, my memories. Nausea rose in my throat, but I forced myself to keep going. Beneath the cash was a thick stack of documents. I took them out and placed them on Harold's workbench, where he used to set his coffee cup every morning. The first folder made my hands tremble, a short-term rental contract. The address was my house. The owner was clearly listed, Ethan. My son's name sat boldly on the line marked owner, like a knife driven straight into the last trust I was still trying to hold on to. I turned the next page. In the notes section, there was a small line of text that made it hard to breathe. Ownership transfer in progress, pending court ruling. Transfer, pending ruling. I set that stack down, took a deep breath, and continued. There was another file, clipped separately with a light-colored cover. On it were words that made my blood run cold. Capacity evaluation. My name was printed clearly. My age. A scheduled evaluation date. The assessment section. Blank. But at the bottom of the page, there was already a doctor's signature. A doctor I had never met. That signature sat there like a forged certainty waiting to be legalized. I flipped the page. Another sheet slid out, a price quote from a place with a very gentle-sounding name, Evergreen Haven, a nursing home, private room, full-time care. The cost was printed boldly at the bottom, a number so high I had to look twice to make sure I wasn't mistaken. Everything had been calculated. They had chosen where to confine me, priced out the rest of my life the way one selects an item from a catalog. My legs felt weak, but I didn't allow myself to sit down. I knew I had to keep going while I still could. At the bottom of the stack was another document, a full power of attorney. My name was already printed under grantor, Ethan's name under agent. Only one thing was missing, my signature. The line was blank, glaringly white. I could picture the moment they were planning, me signing it while not fully aware, then waking up to realize I had handed everything over myself. A small piece of paper slipped out from between the pages. I picked it up, my hands shaking violently. It was a handwritten note, in Natalie's handwriting. I recognized it instantly. The lines were short, clinical, chilling. It mentioned a sedative, dosage, timing, before the evaluation. No further explanation was needed. Everything was painfully clear. I stood there for a long time, listening to my heart pounding in my chest, as if it were reminding me that I was still alive, that I still had the right to decide. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. For a moment, I wanted to burn everything, to erase every trace of this plot, but I knew that wasn't my path. I took out my phone. Every document, every page, every line, I photographed them all. I made sure the lighting was clear, the signatures sharp. I photographed the safe and the cash inside it. I didn't miss a single detail. Each click of the camera felt like reclaiming a piece of control that had been stolen from me. When I put everything back in place, closed the safe, and shut the shed door, I stood still for a moment longer. A light breeze moved through the yard. The house ahead looked as peaceful as ever. But I knew that from this moment on, there was no room left for hesitation. I had seen everything. I had touched the evidence. And I understood with absolute clarity there was only one path forward. Not the path of an impulsive confrontation, not of pleading or hoping for a late awakening. It was the path of truth, revealed at the right moment, in the right way, to protect me from the very people who had planned to erase me from my own life. I left the shed with a strange calm. Not because I was no longer afraid, but because fear had transformed into something else. Cold clarity. Once you face the evidence head-on, there are few choices left. Collapse, or stand up and move forward. I chose the second. That same afternoon, I called Rebecca. It wasn't a panicked call. I spoke slowly, clearly, straight to the point. I told her I had found everything: the cash safe, the contracts, the mental evaluation files, the unsigned power of attorney, the note about sedatives. On the other end of the line, Rebecca was silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was no longer gentle as usual. It was sharp and steady, the voice of someone who had seen enough to know exactly what needed to be done. "Lorraine," she said, "we act now. Not one more minute of waiting." That evening, Rebecca arranged for me to see an independent doctor, someone with no ties, no connections to my family. The appointment was discreet but serious. I answered every question, completed every test, not to prove I was normal, but to create a record that could not be twisted. When the doctor signed the certificate confirming my legal capacity, I felt as if I had reclaimed a piece of territory that had been silently occupied. Rebecca didn't stop there. She immediately drafted revocation documents, revoking any and all powers of attorney, present or future. Any document that might have been signed before, if any existed, was rendered invalid. Everything was notarized, stamped, and properly filed. I signed each page, my hand steady. Every signature redrew a boundary. Then came the will. Rebecca asked if I was sure. I nodded. No tears, no hesitation. We revised the will that very night. Everything was written clearly, transparently, leaving no room for vague interpretation. I didn't do it out of spite. I did it for safety, for truth. And because I had come to understand that once family becomes a tool, it is no longer family. When all the paperwork was finished, Rebecca leaned back in her chair and looked at me for a long moment. "Now," she said, "we plan the counterstrike, not to scare them, but to end this." The plan was simple, and that simplicity was exactly what made it effective. I would return home. I would play the role of a mother back from visiting her sister, tired but content. I would change nothing. No suspicion, no probing questions. I would let Ethan and Natalie continue believing everything was unfolding exactly as they had planned. "We don't drag them into the light yet," Rebecca said. "We let them walk into it themselves." I understood. When people believe they're about to win, they become careless. The next evening I went back home. I pulled my suitcase across the threshold, took a deep breath, and rang the doorbell. The door opened quickly. Natalie stood there, her smile flawless, her eyes lighting up in a way I had once mistaken for joy. Now I knew. It was relief. "You're back," she said sweetly. "How was the trip?" "Good," I replied, smiling just enough. "She's the same as ever, loud but warm." Ethan appeared behind Natalie, looked at me, and nodded. He took my suitcase and placed it neatly in the corner. There were no probing questions, no scrutiny. They trusted me, trusted that I was still the woman they believed they could guide. In the days that followed, I lived exactly as before. I woke early, made coffee, read the paper. I asked Natalie if she needed anything from the store. I smiled when Ethan talked about work. I didn't mention the locked room. I didn't bring up the shed. I even appeared a bit more tired, as if the trip had drained me. Everything flowed so smoothly that sometimes I had to remind myself this was a performance, and they didn't suspect a thing. On the contrary, they seemed more confident. I noticed it in the brief whispers they no longer bothered to hide as carefully. In the way Natalie proactively asked if I wanted to schedule a routine health checkup. In the way Ethan talked about arranging things so Mom wouldn't have to worry so much. Those words in another context might have sounded like care, but I knew exactly what they were. They continued their plan. I knew the date and time, not because they said it outright, but because of the pieces I already had. The appointment schedule in the files, the note about sedatives, the half-veiled comments. I knew the evaluation would happen on a weekday morning. I knew they would choose a time when I was usually most groggy. I knew they had already prepared the script, from taking me there to explaining everything to outsiders. And I let them believe they were about to win. I let Natalie make me tea every evening. I let Ethan remind me to go to bed early. I even pretended to forget small things. My keys, my reading glasses, just enough to reinforce the image they were trying to build. Not too much, just enough. Meanwhile, everything Rebecca had prepared was quietly waiting for the right moment. Documents had been filed, records sealed. The people who needed to know, knew. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to run. I just needed to stand still and let the truth do its work. Some nights I lay in my old bedroom, staring at the ceiling, thinking of Harold. I wondered what he would say if he could see me now. He probably wouldn't say much. He would just place his hand over mine the way he used to and tell me I was doing the right thing. I wasn't afraid anymore. Not because the danger had disappeared, but because I had stopped avoiding it. Ethan and Natalie believed they were very close to the finish line. They believed everything was within their grasp. I let them believe that, because some traps only work when the prey walks in wearing a victorious smile. That night came sooner than I expected. Not because time moved quickly, but because everything had already been set in place, waiting only for the final moment to collapse. As darkness settled, the porch lights turned on as they did every evening. I sat in my room with the door slightly ajar, clearly hearing the familiar rhythm of life downstairs. Natalie moved around the kitchen, the soft clink of dishes touching. Ethan went up and down the stairs, checking locks, checking light switches. They didn't realize that this very professionalism had become the most vivid evidence against them. There were more guests than usual. I recognized it immediately from the first sounds. Not just one couple, then a second, then a group of 3. The sound of suitcases rolling across the tiled porch came one after another, each time making my heartbeat slow by one beat, not from fear, but because I knew I was nearing the end. Natalie greeted them as always, her voice just friendly enough, just discreet enough. I heard soft laughter, brief greetings. Money changed hands. I didn't see it, but I didn't need to anymore. I had seen it too many times. The house was full of guests. I closed my eyes for a brief moment. This was exactly the moment Rebecca had talked about. The moment they felt most confident. The moment they believed no one was watching them anymore. And then the doorbell rang. Not the familiar chime, not the short, cautious press of a renter. This sound was firmer, longer, as if the person outside wasn't asking for permission. Natalie froze. I could clearly hear her footsteps stop in the middle of the living room. Ethan came down the stairs faster than usual. I heard his voice call out, trying to stay calm. "Yes." "Who is it?" A man's voice answered from outside, low and clear. "City Inspector, please open the door for a lodging inspection." Just one sentence, but it was enough to freeze the air inside the house. I stood up, not rushed, not shaking. I adjusted the light jacket on my shoulders and took a deep breath. I didn't step out right away. I let them open the door. I let them face the truth before I appeared. The door opened. I heard shoes stepping inside. Not just one person, at least two. The inspector's voice sounded steady and professional, without emotion. We've received reports of illegal short-term lodging activity at this address. Natalie smiled, a smile I knew all too well, but this time it didn't quite hold together. "There must be a mistake," she said. "This is a private residence." The inspector didn't argue. He simply turned to a younger man and gestured. The man pulled out a camera. "May I ask," the inspector continued, "who are the people present here tonight?" The air went silent for a few seconds. Then a stranger's voice spoke up, a middle-aged man standing near the sofa. "I rented a room here. I paid by the night." Natalie spun toward him. "You—" But it was already too late. Another woman spoke, sounding confused. "We were referred here. We paid cash when we arrived." Sentence by sentence, like bricks falling from the fake wall Natalie and Ethan had built. None of the guests knew they were becoming witnesses, but the truth doesn't need staging. It only needs the right questions. The inspector nodded and took notes. Then he turned to Ethan. "Are you the homeowner?" Ethan opened his mouth. No sound came out for the first second. Natalie stepped forward, trying to regain control. "They're just friends staying over. There's no business going on." The inspector looked straight at her. "Then please explain why multiple unrelated individuals are here with luggage and have confirmed paying for lodging." No one could answer. "We need to inspect the rooms." The inspector said it like a formality, but I knew, and they knew, it was the end. Doors were opened, one room at a time. My old bedroom, the bed not yet made, a suitcase at the foot of the bed, guests' personal items scattered in the bathroom, the next room. Two people. One of them ended a phone call abruptly. The last room down the hall, sheets still damp. The camera clicked repeatedly. Pens scratched on paper. There was nothing left to deny, and that was when I stepped out. I walked down the stairs slowly. Each step was a year of my life in this house. I entered the living room, where all eyes immediately turned to me. I stood straight. "Hello," I said calmly. "I am the legal owner of this house." The inspector turned to me immediately. "You confirm that you did not authorize any rental activity here?" "I have never authorized it," I replied, "and I only just learned about this." Natalie went pale. Ethan turned toward me, eyes wide, as if seeing me for the first time in his life. "Mom," he whispered. I didn't look at him. I looked at the inspector. "I am prepared to provide all documents proving ownership." The inspector nodded. He didn't need any further explanation. The report was written on the spot. Illegal lodging operation, cash payments, no registration, no permit, multiple violations at once. The guests were instructed to leave within 30 minutes. Some were angry, some confused. Some silently pulled their suitcases out of my house, fading into the night like shadows. I stood still, watching each person cross the threshold, people who had never belonged there. When the door closed for the last time, the living room felt painfully empty. The inspector handed Ethan and Natalie the citation. The number printed on it made Natalie grab the back of a chair. "You will receive further summonses for follow-up proceedings," he said. The door closed behind them. Silence, no guests, no roles to play, no place to hide. Natalie turned toward me, her voice breaking. "Mom, I can explain. I think tonight is enough," I said gently but firmly. "The game is over." Ethan collapsed into a chair, burying his face in his hands. Natalie stood frozen like an actor who had forgotten the final line. My house was quiet again, but not the way it used to be, because the truth had been spoken, publicly, in front of everyone. And from that moment on, no one in this house could pretend it had never happened. The door closed behind the inspectors, leaving a silence so heavy I could hear the second hand ticking on the wall clock. Ethan still sat there, head bowed, shoulders slumped as if he had aged 10 years overnight. Natalie stood by the dining table, hands clenched together, lips pale, eyes with nowhere left to hide. I was the one who broke the silence. "Ethan," I said my son's name slowly, without raising my voice. "Look up at me." He lifted his head. In his eyes there was no more calculation, no more confidence of someone who thought he was in control. Only the panic of a child caught doing something unforgivable. "How far were you going to take this?" I asked. "Turning my house into an illegal hotel, preparing paperwork to declare me legally incompetent. And then what? Putting me in a nursing home so you could finish signing everything else?" Ethan trembled. "Mom, I didn't mean—" "You did," I cut him off, my voice strangely calm. "You did, because everything was prepared. The capacity evaluation files, the full power of attorney, even notes about sedatives." Natalie broke down sobbing. "I just wanted things to be easier," she said, her voice shattered. "She's old. She can't manage anymore. We were just—" "Stop," I said, turning to look at her for the first time that night. There was no rage in my eyes, only deep exhaustion. "You have no right to decide my life, and you certainly have no right to drug me to get my signature." Natalie collapsed into a chair, burying her face in her hands. Ethan began to cry out loud, not the kind of crying that begs for mercy, but the sound of someone realizing they've crossed a line they can never undo. I looked at my son for a long time. I remembered holding him as a baby, his first steps in this very living room, the nights I waited up for him when he studied far from home. That love didn't disappear, but it was damaged, permanently. "You will leave this house," I said, "within this week." Natalie looked up, horrified. "Mom, there is no mom right now," I replied. "This house is no longer safe with the two of you in it." Ethan nodded, not arguing. Perhaps for the first time in his life, he understood he had no right to demand anything. I continued, slowly and clearly. "I will not press criminal charges against you, not because I've forgotten what you did, but because I don't want the rest of my life tied to courtrooms and resentment." Ethan collapsed, sobbing. Natalie said nothing more. I didn't comfort them. I didn't insult them either. Some lessons don't need further explanation. A week later, the house was empty again. I changed the locks. I threw open the rooms that had once been locked. I took out Harold's belongings, cleaned them, arranged them, put them back where they belonged. I repainted the bedroom walls, changed the sheets, opened the windows to let the sunlight in. Slowly, the house began to breathe again, with my breath in it. I didn't live alone in bitterness. I lived more slowly. I replanted the small garden out back. I drank coffee on the porch every morning. I smiled at Howard when he came by, and for the first time in a long while, I slept peacefully, without listening for strange noises in the night. Forgiveness didn't come immediately. It wasn't a decision made in one evening. It was a process. I learned to forgive, not to erase what happened, but to keep it from defining the rest of my life. I came to understand a simple but painful truth. Blind love is not love. It's a trap. And sometimes, to protect herself, a mother must learn to draw boundaries, even with her own child. I still love Ethan, but I no longer hand my life over to anyone. And if you've stayed with me to the end, I want to say thank you. Thank you for listening to the story of an older woman who learned to stand up late, but not too late. If you were me, what would you do if your own child tried to take your life away from you? Where are you watching this story from? Leave me a comment. I truly want to hear from you. If this story touched you, please like and subscribe so we can meet again in the stories to come. I'm grateful to you for your time, your empathy, and for bringing your heart here with me until the very end. If you want to stay here after Christmas, you'll need to pay rent. The words rang out across the dinner table, in front of more than 20 people, like a knife driven straight into my chest. I stood there, my hands still smeared with turkey gravy, my ears ringing from the strained, awkward laughter around the table. Not a single pair of eyes looked at me with support. I looked at my son, the one sitting confidently in the seat of the so-called homeowner. And for the first time in my life, I understood something terrifying. My silence had nurtured his ingratitude. I stayed still and said nothing. Not because I was weak, but because in that very moment I decided to leave that house and take with me a truth that could make my son lose everything. If you're still listening, tell me where you're watching from. Every comment you leave is another mark in this journey. And if this story has touched you, don't forget to hit like so it can reach even further. The smell of roasted turkey still hung in the air, mixed with cinnamon from the apple pie and the pine scent of the Christmas tree brushing the living room ceiling. I had been awake since 5 a.m. that morning, as I was every year preparing Christmas dinner for the family. Not because anyone asked me to, but because I had grown used to working quietly behind the scenes, making everything perfect so others could enjoy the holiday. My name is Helen Whitmore. I am 66 years old, a widow, and judging by the way everyone in that room looked at me that night, I was nothing more than an elderly mother living off her son. The long dining table was covered with a crisp white tablecloth. The Christmas china I had carefully kept for over 20 years was neatly arranged. Crystal glasses shimmered under the warm yellow lights. More than 20 people, relatives near and far, my son's friends, my daughter-in-law's co-workers, were gathered around the table. Laughter and polite holiday chatter filled the room. I moved between the kitchen and the dining room like a familiar shadow, refilling California wine glasses, clearing dirty plates, placing more bread on the table. My apron was dotted with gravy stains, my wrinkled hands trembling slightly as I carried heavy serving trays. No one noticed, and I didn't expect them to. Andrew, my son, sat at the head of the table. His suit was perfectly tailored, an expensive watch peeking out from under his cuff. He spoke animatedly about new projects, important meetings, plans for the coming year. His voice carried the confidence of someone who believed everything he had was the rightful result of his own efforts. Vanessa, his wife, sat beside him in a striking red dress, her hair carefully styled as if for a photo shoot. Each time Andrew finished a sentence, she smiled and nodded, smoothly adding a few comments that made the story sound even more impressive. She casually wove in remarks about city living expenses, about how maintaining this lifestyle isn't easy, as if they were harmless observations. I heard the names of upscale restaurants, weekend getaways, utility bills, property taxes, maintenance costs, all spoken in the tone of people carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders. And then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, the conversation shifted to rent. Andrew leaned back in his chair, took a sip of wine, and scanned the table before his gaze landed on me. My heart tightened, not with anger, but recognition. I had seen that look before. It was the look his father, Thomas, wore whenever he made a major decision. The difference was that in Andrew, the look was colder, more self-satisfied. "Speaking of expenses," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "we should clear up a few things, for fairness." The room seemed to pause for a beat. I stood there, still holding the serving spoon, not yet able to put it down. "If Mom wants to stay here after Christmas," Andrew continued, his tone casually cruel, "she'll need to pay rent, like any other adult. Or maybe she should find somewhere more appropriate." No one laughed, but no one objected either. A few people looked down at their plates. Others cleared their throats, pretending to be busy with their wine glasses. Vanessa took a small sip of her wine, the corner of her mouth lifting in the faintest smile, as if everything were unfolding exactly as it should. I felt every beat of my heart in my chest, not from embarrassment, not entirely from pain, but from a hollow sensation spreading inside me, the feeling of someone realizing she had been standing in the wrong place for far too long. I looked around the table. More than 20 faces. People who had eaten the food I cooked, sitting in the house I still called home. Not one pair of eyes stood with me, and in that moment a truth I had avoided for years became painfully clear. I had made it easy for them to treat me this way. I was used to stepping back, used to saying, "It's fine," used to letting my son believe he was carrying me, that I needed him, that my presence in this house was a favor he granted. I had been silent for too long, and that silence had been interpreted as weakness. I placed the spoon down on the tray. The soft clink of metal against porcelain sounded quiet, but in my mind it felt like a full stop. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't hurt, but because I knew that anything I said then would only turn me into a beggar in my own story. I smiled, the polite smile I had practiced my entire life, and excused myself from the table, saying I needed a moment to rest. No one stopped me. No one asked if I was okay. As I walked toward the hallway leading to the bedroom, I heard the party slowly resume behind me. Someone mentioned dessert. Someone turned the Christmas music up a little louder, as if to sweep away the discomfort that had briefly passed through the room. The bedroom door closed behind me, and for the first time that night, I allowed myself to stand still, not to cry, but to think about all the years I had lived this way, about the choices I had made, and about how, if I continued to stay silent, tonight's words would not be the lowest point, only the beginning. I looked at the old suitcase in the corner, lightly coated in dust. I looked at the locked document case hidden deep in the dresser drawer, something no one in this house knew about. And in that absolute silence, I understood that my next silence would no longer be endurance. It would be the beginning. I closed the bedroom door very gently, as if afraid of disturbing someone, a habit I only then realized was meaningless. Outside, the Christmas music grew a little louder. Laughter returned, hesitant at first, then steady again, as if the moment that had just happened had never existed. I leaned against the door, closed my eyes for a few seconds, and took a deep breath. The room was strangely quiet. The only sound was the steady ticking of the wall clock. One Andrew had once said was vintage but didn't fit the apartment style. I walked slowly inside and turned on the small bedside lamp. Its soft yellow light revealed the room I had lived in for the past 3 years, the room I still called mine, though officially it had never truly been. A neatly made single bed, a small wardrobe, a vanity table with a mirror chipped at one corner, Everything was simple, orderly, just like the way I tried to exist in this house, taking up no space, causing no inconvenience, never making anyone feel I was a burden. I sat on the edge of the bed and rested my hands on my knees. They trembled slightly, not from cold, but from a feeling both familiar and new rising in my chest. It wasn't exactly sadness, not quite anger. It was a painful clarity, the moment when someone finally sees her true place in the eyes of those around her. In this house, I was no longer Andrew's mother. I was Andrew's mother in the sense of an outdated responsibility, an older woman living there because of circumstances, because of family, because it's just how it's always been. Someone others could speak to the way they had tonight without considering the consequences. I remembered the looks on a few guests' faces when Andrew said those words. No outrage, no sympathy, just an uncomfortable understanding, the kind of look people give someone who should know better, as if I truly were living off them, and the suggestion was simply a reasonable adjustment. I let out a silent, humorless smile. If only they knew. But I stopped that thought, not out of fear, but because I was beginning to understand that for many years I had allowed that image to exist. I had built it myself, bit by bit, with my silence, my nods, my "it's fine" reassurances that I thought were sacrifices, but were really acts of erasing myself. I remembered the times Andrew introduced me to his friends. This is my mom. She lives with us. Nothing more. No mention of what I had done, what I had given up. And I never corrected him. I let my son feel proud in his role as the devoted son, the family provider. I thought it was good for him. Dinners like tonight weren't the first time I had felt invisible. I was used to sitting at the table and getting up early to clean, used to hearing Andrew talk about our house without ever correcting it to your house. Used to Vanessa joking that I was too frugal, laughing as if it were just a harmless quirk of an old woman. I had yielded so much, all so my son wouldn't feel inferior to anyone. I let Andrew believe he was taking care of me, that I needed his protection. I thought it would make him stronger. I didn't realize that when someone is always placed in the role of the giver, they can easily forget to respect the one receiving. My silence, in the end, had been misunderstood. It wasn't seen as calm or loving. It was seen as acceptance. And from that acceptance, boundaries disappeared. I stood up and walked to the small wooden dresser against the wall. Opening the bottom drawer, I pulled out a dark brown leather document case. It had been there a long time, long enough for the leather to wear thin at the corners, long enough that I almost forgot how heavy it felt in my hands. I placed it on the table and unlocked it. Inside were neatly organized papers, contracts, certificates, numbers printed clearly, cold and precise, things Andrew had never seen, and I had deliberately kept it that way. I turned the pages, not to reread them, but to remind myself I was not the helpless woman they thought I was. I had never been anyone's burden. I had lived a long life, working, calculating, enduring, building. I just never told that story to the right audience. My fingers paused on a familiar page. I exhaled softly, feeling a knot in my chest loosen. It was time, not to prove anything, not to take revenge, but to end a role I had played for far too long. I glanced at the clock. Almost 12 a.m. Outside, it was Christmas, a night people talk about family, love, forgiveness. I reached for my phone, opened my contacts, and stopped on a familiar name, Leonard Brooks. Leonard answered after the second ring. His voice was calm and steady, as always. "Helen, is everything all right?" I didn't expect a call at this hour. "I'm sorry to call so late," I said, keeping my voice even, "but I need to talk to you, now." There was a brief pause on the other end. Leonard didn't ask questions. "I'm listening." I didn't ramble. I didn't complain. I said only what needed to be said. Short, clear sentences. I told him I needed him to prepare a few things, that changes were coming, that I didn't want to wait any longer. Leonard sighed softly as if he had been waiting for this day. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I've never been more sure," I replied. When I hung up, a strange sense of relief settled over me. Not the relief of someone dropping a burden, but the feeling of someone finally straightening her back after years of bending. I opened the closet and pulled out a small suitcase. It wasn't big. I had never needed much. I packed a few simple outfits, the clothes I actually wore, my familiar flats, a warm coat for winter. Nothing extra. I paused in front of the mirror. The woman looking back at me had gray streaks in her hair, deep lines around her eyes. But in that gaze, I saw something I had lost long ago: clarity. I no longer felt like I needed permission to exist. Outside, the laughter continued. I knew what they would think when they saw me rolling out a suitcase. They would assume I was being dramatic, that I'd be back in a few hours, or the next morning, gentle as always, apologizing for making things tense. But not this time. I zipped the suitcase closed. The sound was clean and final. I grabbed the handle and stepped out of the room. When the door shut behind me, I didn't look back. A roll had ended. I pulled the suitcase into the hallway, but instead of heading straight for the door, I stopped in the quiet space. Christmas lights cast faint reflections on the walls, trembling in time with the music drifting from the dining room. In that moment, a very old memory rose up, quietly, gently, like an underground river that had flowed through my entire life. Thomas Whitmore. Just thinking his name made my chest tighten, not from pain, but from a deep, steady longing, the kind that doesn't knock you down but never fully leaves. I met Thomas when I was 22 in a small town in northern New Jersey. Back then, I worked part-time as a bookkeeper for a building supply store. The job wasn't glamorous. Logging entries, checking invoices, counting small numbers. Thomas was a construction worker for the same store. Tall, broad-shouldered, his hands always dusted with cement. He spoke little, smiled gently, and looked at things with a focus that made it seem like every wall and every plot of land held potential. Others hadn't noticed yet. We didn't fall in love all at once. Everything happened slowly. Conversations after work, sitting on the warehouse steps, sharing a cheap cup of coffee. Moments when Thomas asked if I was sure the numbers were right, and I smiled and said numbers don't lie. We married in a simple ceremony with only family and a few close friends. No extravagant dress, no lavish reception. But I remember that day clearly. The feeling that I had chosen the right person to walk through the hardest years with. And hard years there were. In the early years of our marriage, we lived in an apartment so small that if we stood in the kitchen together, we had to turn our backs to each other. Thomas worked from early morning until late at night. I worked 2 jobs, days at the store, nights doing bookkeeping for small local businesses. Some months, the money in our account barely covered rent and basic groceries. We didn't travel. We didn't eat out. Every decision was carefully weighed, but we never complained. Thomas used to say, "As long as we know where the money's going, we'll be okay." And that's exactly how we lived. He built with his hands, and I made sure nothing slipped out of control. When Andrew was born, life became even harder. I remember sleepless nights, rocking the baby with one arm while checking ledgers at the small dining table with the other. Thomas would come home in his work clothes, sit beside me, exhausted but with bright eyes. We didn't have much, but we had each other. And we had one clear belief: the future doesn't come from luck, it comes from persistence. The first house we bought wasn't a home in the romantic sense. It was old, cracked walls, a leaking roof, in a neighborhood people shook their heads at when driving by. But Thomas looked at it like an unfinished blueprint. He said, "It has good bones, it just needs work." We bought it with all our savings, plus a loan I had to calculate down to every dollar of interest. Thomas fixed it up with his own hands every weekend. I handled the paperwork, pulled permits, negotiated material prices. Andrew was still little back then, often sitting on the floor playing with scrap pieces of wood, giggling every time Thomas handed him an old nail. When that house sold for more than we expected, I still remember the feeling of holding the check in my hand, not because of the money, but because it confirmed that what we were doing was right. We didn't spend that money. We used it to buy the second one, then the third. Every time, Thomas saw potential where others only saw risk, and I made sure we never crossed the line. I tracked every expense, every contract, every smallest number. No decision was made without passing through my hands. Whitmore Holdings was born not as some grand dream, but as a necessary step. A lawyer advised us to form a company to manage the assets better. Thomas named it simply, after our last name. No flourish, no show. From the outside, we looked like any other middle-class couple. I still drove an old car. Thomas still wore work clothes. Andrew grew up in a home that wasn't overflowing, but was steady, and that was intentional. I remember clearly the conversation Thomas and I had late one night after Andrew had fallen sound asleep. Thomas said he didn't want our son growing up feeling like the world owed him something. He wanted Andrew to understand the value of work, of effort. I agreed. We decided that the less we talked about assets, the better. Not because we were ashamed, but because we believed there were things that should only be seen once a person was mature enough to understand them. Then Thomas died suddenly. It was a cold, rainy morning. He was checking on a job site when he collapsed. The heart attack came fast and gave no one a chance to prepare. When I got to the hospital, he was no longer awake. I held his hand, felt the warmth slowly leaving, and in that moment, my world felt like it stopped. After the funeral, everything turned quiet in a terrifying way. Andrew was still young then, trying to act strong, but I saw fear in his eyes. I didn't allow myself to fall apart, not because I didn't hurt, but because if I went down, there would be no one left standing. I took over Whitmore Holdings in silence. No press conference, no announcement. Leonard Brooks, the man who had worked with us from the beginning, became my right hand. I sat in the small office in the back and kept doing what I had always done, making sure everything ran smoothly. Andrew only knew that everything was fine, and I let him believe that. I kept living simply. I didn't change my lifestyle. I didn't show off. I let my son believe I needed him, that he was carrying me. Part of me thought that would help him grow up, but I didn't foresee the cost of hiding the truth for so long. Standing in the hallway tonight, the suitcase by my feet, I realized all those years no one ever saw, had led me to this moment. Not to blame anyone, but to understand that some sacrifices, if placed in the wrong spot, turn into erasure. I bent down and gripped the suitcase handle tightly. I wasn't carrying the past to accuse anyone. I was carrying it as a truth that was finally ready to be acknowledged. And this time, I wouldn't hide it anymore. I stood still for a few more seconds in the hallway, then pulled the suitcase forward. The wheels rolled softly over the wood floor, making a small but distinct sound. That sound pulled me back to another chapter of my life, one where things began to tilt off course, very slowly, very quietly, so much so that by the time I noticed, it was already too late. Andrew graduated from college during a spring with a lot of rain. I still remember his graduation day. I sat in the stands, my hand clenched around my old purse, watching Andrew in his cap and gown with a heart full of pride and worry at the same time. My son was smart and hard-working, but the job market back then wasn't easy. His first job was at a small architecture firm, and the pay was enough to live on, but only enough in the bare minimum sense. Andrew wanted more than that. I could see it in his eyes when he talked about luxury apartments, livable neighborhoods, classmates who had already moved to a bigger city. I understood that ambition. I had once felt it too. And because I understood, I made a decision whose consequences I wouldn't fully see until much later. I told Andrew that my company had an empty apartment, not an ordinary one. An apartment with space, in an area where the market rent was higher than Andrew's monthly paycheck. I said it was an internal discount that I could help him rent it for much less. Andrew refused at first, saying it wasn't fair. I laughed and said that sometimes life needs a good start. I lied, not completely, but enough that he didn't ask more questions. I didn't tell him the apartment belonged to Whitmore Holdings. I didn't tell him the rent I offered was only a small fraction of the real price. I only told him it was a temporary opportunity to help him get settled. Andrew moved into that apartment with a pride he didn't bother to hide. I remember the first time I walked in. He spun around once, laughed out loud, and said he was finally living the way his hard work deserved. I stood beside him, smiling, saying nothing. I was used to saying nothing. After a while, Andrew asked about a car. Architecture work required meeting clients, going to job sites, moving around a lot. Andrew's old car wasn't suitable anymore. I thought about it for a long time, then told Leonard to arrange for Andrew to use a car registered under the company. Just temporarily, I said, just for work convenience. Andrew didn't read the paperwork carefully. He only saw the new car, the way people looked at him differently when he parked in front of the office. I saw that and I let it happen. I thought that if he felt more confident, he would go farther. Then came the credit card. Andrew told me there were emergencies sometimes, unexpected expenses, things he needed to pay up front before getting reimbursed. I opened my drawer, took out a secondary card linked to my account, and handed it to him. "Only use it when you need to," I said. "Don't abuse it." Andrew nodded very seriously. I believed him. At first, everything was just as I expected. Small, reasonable charges, a business meal, a few necessary things for the apartment. I reviewed the statements each month and saw it was still under control, and I stayed silent. Then Vanessa appeared. Vanessa came into Andrew's life like a strong wind, confident, bright, always sure of what she wanted. The first time I met her, Vanessa wore a bold dress, talked fast, her eyes always searching for attention. She complimented Andrew's apartment, complimented the car, complimented my son's taste. Andrew stood beside her, wearing a smile I rarely saw before, the smile of someone who felt he had achieved something worth admiring. Vanessa brought a different world with her, a world of expensive restaurant dinners, weekend trips, things I had never considered necessary. Andrew changed quickly. He started talking more about image, about status, about how he had to look the part in other people's eyes. I saw that change, but I didn't intervene. I told myself it was just a phase, that once Andrew was stable enough, he would adjust on his own. I used to believe that with enough love and patience, everything would balance itself out. The bills started getting thicker. I was still the one receiving the statements. I was still the one seeing every number. Charges for high-end restaurants, stores I had never set foot in, trips I wasn't told about beforehand. I sat at my desk, the lamp casting light onto the white pages, my hand resting on the keyboard, my chest heavy. I could have spoken. I could have stopped it, but I didn't. Every time I considered bringing it up, Andrew would talk about a new project, a new opportunity. Every time I saw the excitement in his eyes, I would think, a little more won't hurt. Vanessa always had a way of making it sound reasonable. Investing in image, building relationships. You can't be cheap in this industry. And I stayed silent. That silence wasn't blindness. I saw it clearly, but I chose to step aside, as if as long as I didn't say anything, it would stop on its own. I underestimated the power of privileges handed out with no boundaries attached. Andrew slowly came to believe everything he had was because he deserved it, that the apartment was a reward for effort, that the car was proof of status, that the credit card was just a convenient tool, nothing more. And Vanessa never stopped reinforcing that belief. She talked about the life Andrew deserved, about how you can't live like an ordinary person if you want to succeed. Those words seeped into my son's thinking, little by little, until they became truth in his mind. And I kept playing the role of the simple, frugal mother who asked for nothing. I let Andrew believe he was taking care of me. I let him take pride in that role. I didn't realize that when someone believes they're the one giving, it becomes very easy for them to forget gratitude. Mistakes didn't arrive all at once. They accumulated, like small drops of water falling steadily, unnoticed, until one day the glass overflowed. Tonight, at that Christmas dinner table, the glass overflowed, and I, at last, stopped trying to keep it from spilling. I left the house while the party was still going on behind me. Laughter, clinking glasses, familiar Christmas music carried on as if nothing had happened. The door closed behind me softly, but inside me, it felt like a clear final period on a role I had played for years. The car took me to the small apartment on the west side of the city, where I stayed whenever I needed quiet. On Christmas night, the streets were emptier than usual. Decorative lights reflected off the wet pavement, stretching into long, blurry streaks. I looked out the window and my chest no longer felt hollow the way it had at the dinner table. Instead, there was a cold, lucid awareness. As if, after years, I was finally seeing everything with my own eyes. When I stepped into the apartment, I didn't turn on the lights right away. I set my bag down and stood in the darkness for a few seconds. The familiar scent of old wood, books, a space no one could intrude on made me breathe deeper. Here, I could be myself. Not the mother living off someone, not a shadow behind my son's success. I turned on the table lamp, opened my phone, and called Naomi Feldman. Naomi answered after the second ring. Her voice was low and steady, carrying the clarity of someone used to late, unannounced calls. I didn't need to explain much. I just said I needed to see her right away, tonight. Naomi paused briefly and replied, "I'm at the office, come." Naomi's office was in an older building with soft yellow lighting and a quiet so deep I could hear footsteps in the hallway. When I walked in, Naomi was already seated behind her desk, a file open in front of her. She looked at me, not with suspicion, just waiting. I told her about the Christmas dinner. No embellishment, no complaints, just what happened. Each sentence, each silence, Naomi listened, her hands folded together. When I finished, she nodded slightly. "We'll do this cleanly," Naomi said. "No emotion, just legal." I nodded. That was exactly what I wanted. Naomi pulled the first file closer. The lease. The apartment Andrew was living in. She turned the pages, her finger stopping at a small but clear clause. The lease had a term, conditions for non-renewal, and the right to end it under the law with proper notice. "Everything is legal," Naomi said. "Nothing vague." I looked at the familiar lines and remembered the day I signed that lease. Andrew had signed quickly, without reading carefully. Back then, I hadn't said a word, and now I didn't need to explain. Naomi moved to the second file. The car documents, the company name, temporary use, no personal ownership clause. Everything was so clear it couldn't be argued. "I can take it back right away," I said. Naomi nodded. "Yes, and there's no legal basis to fight it." The third file was the credit card. Statements spread across pages, numbers following numbers. Naomi didn't comment. She simply placed her finger on the total at the bottom of the page. I looked at that number and felt no anger, only exhaustion. Not because of the money, but because for so long I had used my silence to legitimize a life my son hadn't earned. Naomi looked up at me. "You know what you're doing, right?" "I do," I said. And this time, I truly did. For a very brief moment, my heart tightened. The thought of Andrew, the child I once held in my arms, the nights I stayed awake when he had a fever, flickered through me. But then I remembered his eyes at the table, the way he spoke about rent, the way he looked at me as if I were an obvious burden. I took a deep breath. I don't want to do this halfway. Naomi raised her eyebrows slightly, but she wasn't surprised. "Then we'll do it decisively?" We reviewed everything, step by step, the order of notices, deadlines, the process of repossession. Nothing personal, nothing meant to punish, just restoring boundaries I should have set long ago. As Naomi printed the final documents, I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a few seconds. The inner struggle wasn't loud the way I once imagined. It felt like a slow, steady wave, carrying me toward a decision I could not reverse. That night, I understood something with painful clarity. Love without boundaries isn't love. It's leniency disguised as sacrifice. And that leniency had made Andrew believe everything he had was automatic. When Naomi handed me the papers to sign, my hand didn't shake. My name appeared on the page, clear, firm. Not the signature of an angry mother, but of a woman deciding to take responsibility for her own mistake. When I left the law office, dawn was close. The city was still quiet. I drove slowly back to the apartment. Once inside, I made a cup of hot tea and sat by the window. The first light of the new day began to slip through the blinds. For the first time in a long time, I felt I wasn't being pulled in two directions. I wasn't torn between being a mother and being myself. Everything had fallen into its proper place. I turned off the light and went to bed. That night, even though it was short, I slept peacefully. No dreams, no jolting awake, just the deep sleep of someone who had accepted the truth and stopped running from it. The next morning, I woke up before it was fully light. The apartment was so quiet I could hear the heater clicking softly, the steady drip of water in the sink. I made coffee and stood by the window, looking down at a street where only a few people were out early walking their dogs. Everything looked normal, too normal compared to what I knew was beginning on the other side of the city. My phone vibrated lightly on the kitchen table. A text from Naomi, very short. "The notice has been sent, email and hard copy, everything on schedule." I read it and set my phone down. There was no feeling of victory, no regret, only a deep stillness, as if I had just closed a door that had been left open too long. Somewhere, Andrew was opening his email inbox. I can picture the scene clearly even though I'm not there. Andrew has a habit of checking his email in the morning, right after sitting down at the table, his coffee cup still steaming. My son usually scrolls quickly, skipping advertisements and unimportant notifications, but that subject line wouldn't be skipped. Notice of non-renewal of lease agreement. Andrew would open it, read the first line, then the second. I know he would have to read it at least 2 or 3 times to make sure he wasn't misunderstanding. That apartment in Andrew's mind was home. It was an achievement, proof that he had accomplished something in life. But an email has no emotions. It only talks about clauses, deadlines, the date the apartment must be handed back, clear, cold, no room for negotiation. And then would come the second blow. Andrew would keep reading, then call the management office, his voice tight, trying to stay calm. He would ask why, say he had always paid on time, never caused trouble. And on the other end of the line, another professional voice would repeat that this was the landlord's legal right, and that if Andrew wanted to continue renting, he could submit a new application at the current market rate. The real rent. I can imagine that moment very clearly. The instant he hears the number, the calculation racing through his mind so fast it almost hurts. Andrew's income, the fixed expenses, the familiar bills, none of it would line up anymore. There would be no way to make it work. The third blow would come faster than I expected. Vanessa would be the first to discover it. I picture Vanessa in a store, bright lights overhead, the familiar scent of perfume, her hand holding the card she was used to swiping without thinking. Vanessa isn't someone who checks balances. She's used to everything being approved. And then the card reader would make a short, dry sound, declined. At first, it would be a mistake. Vanessa would force a smile and ask them to try again. Then again. The cashier's expression would shift slightly, from polite to cautious. People waiting in line behind her would start to look. Vanessa would leave the store with her face flushed, her hand gripping her phone tightly. The call to Andrew would be impatient, blunt, just panic mixed with anger. My card doesn't work. What's going on? Andrew would open his banking app, see the notification that the secondary card had been locked. No warning, no explanation, just a simple cold line of text. And then, as if that weren't enough, the next blow would come the same day, the car. Andrew would head down to the parking garage, keys in hand, his mind still tangled up in the email and Vanessa's call. He would slow when he saw the familiar, empty space. That parking spot, the one where the car was always parked, would now be vacant. At first, he would think he was mistaken. He'd walk a few more steps, look left, look right. But no, the car wouldn't be there. I can see Andrew standing frozen for a few seconds, his heart racing, cold sweat breaking out despite the winter air. Then he would call the garage, his voice starting to lose control. And on the other end, someone would explain briefly that the vehicle had been repossessed at the legal request of the owner. Everything would collapse at once. Panic would come last, but it would be the strongest. Andrew would call me. I know that. He would call again and again. When I didn't answer, he would text. At first, confusion, then anger. What did you do? Have you lost your mind? I wouldn't reply, not because I wanted to run away, but because some lessons cannot be taught over the phone. Andrew would start blaming. He would say I went too far, that I humiliated him, that I destroyed the life he had built. He wouldn't mention his words at the Christmas dinner. He wouldn't bring up paying rent. In his panic, he would only see his own loss. And then, for the first time in his life, Andrew would feel what it means to be empty-handed. No home, no car, no emergency savings, no safety net. I know that feeling. I lived it when I was young. But for Andrew, it would arrive suddenly, like being pushed off a height with no time to prepare. After the first wave of anger would come doubt. Andrew would start asking questions. How could everything be taken back so easily? Why did the contract allow it? Why wasn't the car actually his? Why was the credit card in my name? He would begin to re-examine details he had never paid attention to before. Documents he signed without reading. Vague answers I had given him. The times I avoided his questions when he pressed too hard. And then, Andrew would start digging. My son isn't foolish. Once the shell of confidence is stripped away, what remains is a mind capable of analysis. Andrew would go back through old emails, old contracts. He would search for information about Whitmore Holdings, a name he had heard me mention in passing but never considered important. Every search result would be a small shock. The company, the assets, the connections, familiar names appearing in places Andrew never expected, and the pieces would begin to fall into place. I know that somewhere in that process, Andrew would stop. He would sit for a long time, staring at the screen, his mind blank. Not angry, but filled with another feeling, the realization that for years he may have been living inside a story that wasn't entirely true. One shock would follow another, quietly, without drama, not like in the movies, but deep and impossible to avoid. As for me, I sat in my quiet apartment, my hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold. I wasn't happy, but I wasn't in as much pain as I thought I would be either. I was simply waiting. Not waiting for an apology, not waiting for remorse. I was waiting for the moment my son would begin to see the world through his own eyes, not through the privileges he once believed were natural. The days that followed passed slowly, as if time itself was cautious of what was about to be uncovered. I didn't actively check on what Andrew was doing, but I knew he couldn't stay still. Some falls force a person to stare at the ground for a long time before lifting their head again, and Andrew was right in the middle of that moment. The truth began to surface from a single name, Whitmore Holdings. That name had once been nothing more than a vague phrase to Andrew, something that appeared occasionally in my passing comments or on envelopes he never opened. But now Andrew typed it into the search bar with a different mindset, not idle curiosity, but an anxiety he couldn't shake. I imagine Andrew sitting in front of his computer screen, the blue glow reflecting on a face hollowed out by several sleepless nights. The results weren't loud, no sensational headlines, no shocking news, just corporate records, dry but precise information, year of formation, areas of operation, asset portfolios. And then my name appeared, not as someone's mother, not as a footnote, but right there in the center, clear, undeniable. My name listed as the principal shareholder, legal representative, the person signing documents Andrew had signed beneath, as a tenant, a user, someone who had been favored. I know that moment would be silent, no shouting, no slamming fists, just a sudden void opening up in my son's mind where old beliefs collapsed all at once. The apartment, the car, the credit card. None of them were rewards for effort anymore, but things placed in his hands deliberately and taken back just as easily. Andrew would push his chair back, stand up, pace around the bare room. He would remember every time I said, "It's fine." Every time I refused to buy something new for myself, every meal I cooked in silence, pieces that once seemed disconnected would suddenly lock together in a way that made it hard to breathe. But Andrew still wouldn't fully understand. Not yet. So he would go to the only person left who could tell the whole story without evasion. Aunt Ruth. Ruth is Thomas's sister, almost 10 years older than me. She lives in the suburbs in a small, aging house with a yard always neatly trimmed. Ruth witnessed nearly my entire adult life, from the early years of hardship to the moment I chose to step back. I can imagine Andrew standing at her door, his hands awkward in his coat pockets, exhaustion and fear in his eyes. Ruth would open the door, see him, and sigh softly. She wouldn't be surprised. Perhaps she'd been waiting for this day for a long time. They would sit across from each other in the small living room, hot tea steaming. Ruth wouldn't circle around the topic. She would look straight at Andrew and say, "You're here to ask about your mother, aren't you?" Andrew would nod. For the first time in days, my son wouldn't try to appear strong. His voice would go hoarse as he asked why everything was this way, why I lived so simply, almost invisibly, while behind me stood an entire structure he had never known about. Ruth wouldn't answer right away. She would look out the window where bare branches swayed lightly in the winter wind. Then she would begin to tell the story, without embellishment, without dramatizing it. She would talk about me when I was young, about the years I worked without rest, about how I managed every dollar, every expense, while Thomas laid brick by brick, about the nights I sat at the kitchen table with ledgers while Andrew slept in the next room. Ruth would talk about my decision after Thomas died, about choosing not to change my lifestyle, about wanting Andrew to grow up as an ordinary person, to understand the value of work and independence, about my deepest fear, that if my son knew he was standing on too thick a cushion, he would never learn how to stand on his own. Andrew would sit silently, no arguments, no interruptions. What Ruth said wouldn't sound like an accusation. It would sound like a calm account of choices I had carried alone. When Ruth finished, the room would fall quiet. Andrew would lower his head. For the first time, he would look at himself not through the lens of success, but through the consequences of arrogance. He would remember the Christmas dinner, the way he spoke about rent as if it were obvious, the look in my eyes then, not angry, just quiet. Andrew would begin to understand that my silence wasn't weakness, but a choice. Meanwhile, Vanessa wouldn't accept the truth so easily. When Andrew told her what he had discovered, Vanessa's reaction wasn't shock, it was outrage. She didn't see the lesson, she only saw the loss. Vanessa would say I had deceived them, that I was selfish, that I had staged an entire performance to control my son's life. She would speak loudly, quickly, as if volume alone could change reality. Andrew would try to explain, try to say that maybe he had been wrong, but Vanessa wouldn't listen. To her, this truth meant losing the image she had built, an image of a glamorous life admired by others. Arguments would grow more frequent, no longer small disagreements, but direct confrontations. Vanessa would accuse Andrew of lacking backbone. Andrew would accuse Vanessa of only caring about money. Words would be thrown without restraint. And then, in the rare quiet moments between arguments, Andrew would begin to unravel. Not because he lost the apartment, not because he lost the car, but because he lost the story he had been telling himself. The story that he had built everything on his own, that he stood where he stood because he deserved it. When that story collapsed, Andrew no longer knew who he was without it. My son would begin to replay every action, every word. He would remember how he treated me, not cruelly but without respect. He would remember his blind confidence at the head of the Christmas table, speaking about financial responsibility as if I were an outsider. Regret wouldn't arrive like a storm. It would come slowly, heavy and persistent. It would make it hard to sleep, hard to finish a meal. It would make Andrew feel ashamed for the first time in his life, not before others, but before himself. As for me, I wasn't there to witness it, but I knew, because some changes don't need to be seen to be felt. They spread through silence, through unanswered questions, through a person finally repositioning themselves in the world, and that was only the beginning of awakening. In the days that followed, Andrew fell out of his familiar orbit faster than I had ever imagined. No longer in a spacious apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a busy street, he moved into a place he would never have paused at before. An aging building tucked between modest storefronts, narrow and dark stairwells, the smell of dampness mixed with cheap laundry detergent. The elevator often broke down, so Andrew had to climb to the 4th floor, each step creaking as if reminding him this wasn't a short visit. His new apartment was so small that morning light had to squeeze through a single window, slanting across a stained wall. There was almost no furniture, just an old bed, a chipped wooden table, and a plastic chair faded with age. Andrew stood in the empty room, took a long breath, then set his suitcase down. He didn't say it out loud, but in that moment, he knew. This was the bottom. Vanessa didn't come with him. Her departure was swift and cold, just like her arrival in Andrew's life. No tears, no hesitation, only firm words about how she couldn't live like this, about a life she hadn't signed up to endure. Vanessa packed her things, leaving the room behind with a sharp slam of the door. Andrew stood still, his hand gripping the back of the chair, watching her leave without managing to say a single word. For the first time, my son was truly alone. In the days that followed, Andrew began doing something he had never had to do before: count every dollar. He sat at the small table, a blank sheet of paper laid out, a pen placed neatly beside it, and started writing numbers down: rent, utilities, food, transportation. Expenses that once seemed trivial suddenly turned heavy. He discovered that even one meal out could throw off the entire week's plan. Andrew learned how to cook simple meals over and over again: fried eggs, boiled pasta, canned soup. He stood in front of the stove listening to the oil crackle, his hands clumsy but with no other choice. Every time he poured food onto a plate, Andrew thought about dinners from before: brightly lit restaurants, crisp white tablecloths, wine glasses shimmering. The comparison brought no comfort, only a tightness in his throat. Money wasn't enough. Andrew started looking for extra work, not glamorous jobs or ones he once thought were worthy of him, but late shifts, manual labor, work he had once walked past without noticing. He worked at a small store, stocking shelves, wiping them down. On nights, he came home late, his back aching and legs heavy with exhaustion. Andrew lay on his bed staring at the low ceiling and thinking about earlier days, when he walked out of an office in a tailored suit, believing he had reached some position in life. Shame came slowly, but it lingered. Andrew avoided meeting old friends. He didn't want to explain, didn't want to answer polite questions about how things were going. He feared the searching looks, the long silences after he mentioned his new place. Some evenings, he sat alone in the small room, the sound of traffic outside drifting in endlessly, and realized that loneliness wasn't as loud as people imagined. It simply sat there, covering everything. He compared his current life to his old one, not to mourn it, but to understand it. Every object he once used, every convenience he took for granted, now carried a clear price. Andrew began to understand that work wasn't just a title printed on a business card, but every hour on his feet, every minute spent laboring, every dollar exchanged for effort. Some nights he wondered who he had become over the years, not the person he thought he was, and not the person he wanted to be. He remembered talking about success in front of others, remembered the certainty in his voice when speaking about financial responsibility, remembered the Christmas dinner, where he had placed me below numbers. Questions began to surface, impossible to push aside. Andrew questioned his own worth, what he had truly accomplished, which parts of his life came from effort and which came from support he had never acknowledged. One night after midnight, Andrew sat at the small table, his phone placed in front of him. The screen lit up with my name and his contacts. He hesitated for a long time. Words appeared, then were deleted. He didn't know how to begin. Apologize for what first? For his words at the dinner? For years of arrogance? Or for failing to see me as an independent person? In the end, Andrew typed a short message. No embellishment, no excuses, just a rough, awkward but sincere apology. He said he had been wrong, that he was learning how to live again from the beginning, that if possible, he hoped to talk to me, not to ask for help, but to ask to listen. The message was sent. Andrew set the phone down, his heart beating faster than usual. He waited. A few minutes passed, then 10. No reply. Andrew watched the screen fade to dark. That silence wasn't like before. It wasn't defiant and it wasn't punishment. It felt like an empty space that needed time to be filled. My son sat there, his back against the chair, accepting for the first time that some things couldn't be repaired immediately. As for me, I read the message very late. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't hear it, but because I understood that sometimes silence is the only lesson left to teach. I set the phone down, looked out the window at the distant city lights, and knew my son was walking a necessary road, one no mother could walk for him, and I let him walk it. Time passed slowly, but it didn't stop. After the first weeks of struggling with his new life, Andrew gradually realized that simply enduring wasn't enough. He needed a different anchor, not money, not status, but a reason to wake up each morning without feeling ashamed of himself. The first job Andrew took after the collapse was unlike anything he had done before. It was a temporary position at a small construction company that specialized in renovating older homes in working-class neighborhoods. The pay was low, so low that when Andrew read the number in the confirmation email, he let out a dry laugh. But he accepted it. There were no glass offices, no personal desks, no business cards with titles. Andrew wore old jeans, safety boots, a hard hat, and stood on job sites filled with dust and the clang of metal. On his first morning, he arrived earlier than scheduled, standing awkwardly among workers who had known each other for years. No one cared where he used to live or what kind of car he drove. Here, people only cared whether he could do the work. Andrew started with the simplest tasks: carrying materials, cleaning up, measuring. Some days his hands blistered from tools. His back hurt so badly that at night he only wanted to lie still. But strangely, that exhaustion carried none of the emptiness he felt before. Each evening, washing his hands in cold water, looking at small cuts on his skin, Andrew knew he had done something real, even if it was small. Gradually, he began to understand his father's profession in a way he never had before. Andrew remembered Thomas Whitmore coming home with dusty clothes, sun-darkened hands, the smell of wood and cement clinging to his jacket. Back then, Andrew was young and only thought his father worked hard. Now, standing on job sites himself, Andrew understood what that hardship meant, how small decisions could affect others' safety, how a single mismeasured millimeter could lead to serious consequences. Some afternoons, Andrew sat eating lunch with the other workers on concrete steps. Simple meals, bread, hot soup, inexpensive fruit. The men and women around him talked about their lives openly without pretense or display. Some supported entire families in cramped apartments. Some worked 2 or 3 jobs just to cover rent. Andrew listened, first awkwardly, then thoughtfully. For the first time, he saw people who had far less than he did, less money, fewer choices, but no less dignity. They worked hard, laughed when they could, complained when necessary, but didn't see themselves as victims. Andrew realized he had been living inside a bubble, where worries were about image and status, not about tomorrow's meal. Andrew's life gradually shrank. No more impulse purchases, no more frequent dining out. He learned to live with what he truly needed: a small room to sleep, a meal that filled him, a job tiring enough that he could sleep deeply at night. That simplicity didn't make him feel deprived. On the contrary, it made him feel lighter. And within that simplicity, something else began to form: self-respect. Not the kind tied to other people's opinions, but the feeling of standing on his own 2 feet. Andrew no longer needed to prove anything every time he left the house. He knew what he was doing, why he was doing it, and how far he could go if he kept going. The idea took shape one rainy afternoon. Andrew was standing, looking at an old house being renovated, peeling walls, a leaking roof, yet still capable of becoming a decent place to live if redesigned thoughtfully. He realized that many problems weren't about lack of space, but about how space was used. Small apartments could become brighter and more functional if designed differently. The thought didn't leave Andrew's mind. That evening, after finishing a simple meal, he sat at the table and took out paper and pen. Not drawings for clients, not assigned projects, just rough sketches, room layouts, ways to use light, ways to reduce material costs while keeping safety intact. Andrew worked until he lost track of time. Some nights he looked up to find dawn approaching, drawings piled up on the table, numbers scribbled in the margins. He began to imagine a model for affordable housing, not temporary, not patchwork, but dignified living spaces for people who had never had better options. He thought of the people he met on job sites, families living packed together, children studying under dim lights. Andrew didn't think about profit first. He thought about feasibility, about how a house could be built at the lowest cost while still being sturdy, bright, and warm. When exhaustion set in, Andrew thought of me. Not to blame, not to ask, but to understand. He began to see more clearly the path I had walked, the patience, the discipline, the unglamorous but steady decisions. Andrew realized that what he was doing now closely resembled what Thomas Whitmore once did, and what I had quietly built. The new person within Andrew didn't appear suddenly. It didn't arrive with a brilliant moment of awakening. It grew slowly, day by day, in sweat, repetition, and small but consistent choices. Andrew was no longer a man who believed he deserved everything good simply because he wanted it. He began to understand that value isn't given, it's created. And somewhere far away, I felt that change without anyone telling me. There are bonds between mother and son that don't need words to be recognized. I knew Andrew was being reborn, not into a more perfect version, but into a truer one. And for the first time in a very long while, I believed my son was on the right path. Life has its own way of bringing people back to familiar places, but with an entirely different mindset. Andrew received an email inviting him to present his project late one evening, just after finishing a long shift at the job site. The subject line was brief, unadorned, but enough to make him sit still for several seconds in front of the screen. An investment group was looking for low-cost, sustainable housing ideas, and someone had passed along Andrew's sketches. He read the email again and again, not because he didn't understand it, but because he was afraid he did. The invitation promised nothing. No mention of budget, no talk of partnership, just a presentation. But to Andrew, that was more than enough. The meeting day arrived faster than he expected. That morning, Andrew stood in front of the mirror in his small apartment, adjusting a carefully ironed shirt. He didn't have many clothing options, no expensive suit, no shiny watch, just clean, neat, sufficient clothes. When he left, Andrew carried a thick folder, not only drawings, but notes, numbers, and lived experience. The location of the meeting stunned him the moment he stepped off the bus. A tall building, glass reflecting the pale gray morning sky. Andrew stood at the entrance, gripping his bag strap, his heart beating faster. He had passed this place before, but never like this. Back then, he entered as someone favored, believing every door opening was natural. Now he entered with the caution of someone who knew he had to earn every step. Andrew gave his name at the reception desk. The receptionist smiled politely and directed him upstairs. The elevator ride felt slow, or perhaps Andrew simply felt it that way. Each passing floor matched a stronger heartbeat. When the meeting room door opened, Andrew stepped inside and froze. I was seated at the head of the table, not as his mother, not with the familiar eyes of family dinners. I wore simple but polished attire, my hair neatly tied back, a folder in front of me identical to everyone else's. My gaze was forward, showing no personal emotion. Andrew felt the air in the room thicken. He looked at me, then around. Serious, unfamiliar faces waiting. No one looked surprised. No one introduced me as someone's mother. In this room, I was a member of the panel. Andrew swallowed. In that moment, he understood clearly. This wasn't a meeting arranged out of family ties. If he stood here, there was only one reason. His project had been considered serious enough to hear. I didn't nod. I didn't smile. I simply opened the folder in front of me like everyone else. Andrew was invited to begin. His voice was slightly hoarse at first, then quickly steadied. He didn't talk about lofty terminology. He didn't boast about academic achievements. Andrew spoke about old houses he had repaired, about families he had met, about how living in a small room had changed the way he saw space. He talked about how every square foot had to be calculated to be both economical and humane. The drawings were projected, not perfect, but real. Numbers were explained through lived experience, material costs, construction time, scalability. Andrew didn't avoid difficulties. He spoke plainly about limits, risks, and what could go wrong without careful oversight. The panel began asking questions. Some asked about financial feasibility, some about legal issues. Some doubted whether such a model could scale. Andrew answered each one without defensiveness or argument. When he wasn't sure, he said he needed more data. When challenged, he described what he had seen firsthand. I sat there, listening. Not as a mother waiting for her son to get it right, but as someone who had reviewed hundreds of projects and heard hundreds of presentations. And I could clearly see the difference. Andrew wasn't trying to impress. He was simply telling his truth. The exchange lasted longer than expected. When the final question ended, the room fell into a brief silence. Andrew stood still, both hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, waiting. No hope, no disappointment, just acceptance. Finally, the chair spoke. The decision was made, neither rushed nor delayed. The panel agreed to move forward one step further. Not a full approval of the project, but a pilot phase, a small site, a limited budget, a clear timeline. And with it came conditions. Andrew would be directly responsible. No privileges, no personal interference. All reports had to be transparent. Every decision had to be explained. If it failed, the project would stop. I looked at Andrew for the first time since he'd entered the room. My expression didn't soften, but it wasn't cold either. It was simply direct. Andrew nodded. He didn't say thank you. He wasn't emotional. In his eyes was a very clear understanding. This was not a favor. This was an opportunity, and opportunities must be paid for with responsibility. When the meeting ended, everyone stood up and gathered their papers. Andrew remained there for a few seconds, as if he needed extra time to believe that what had just happened was real. Then he turned and walked out of the conference room without looking back. I watched his back disappear, not calling out, not stopping him. Not because I was indifferent, but because I knew this moment didn't need words. That fateful meeting didn't heal everything immediately. It didn't erase old wounds. But it placed Andrew in the right position, not under my shadow and not on a false pedestal, but where he stood on his own 2 feet. The project began quietly, nothing like Andrew had once imagined. There was no grand groundbreaking ceremony, no stirring speeches, just a small plot of land, a few old buildings marked for renovation, a modest group of workers, and a packed schedule of tasks to complete. Andrew stepped into the role of project lead with intense focus, as if a single moment of distraction could cause everything to slip away. My son worked harder than at any other time in his life. He arrived at the site early in the morning and left late at night. Andrew no longer stood on the sidelines, holding drawings like an observer. He was in the middle of everything, resolving disputes between builders and suppliers, checking every small detail, learning how to balance progress with safety. Some days he returned to his small apartment covered in dust, completely exhausted, but his eyes were no longer empty as before. The first mistake came sooner than Andrew had hoped. A batch of materials was ordered with the wrong specifications. Not a major error, but enough to slow progress and increase costs. When the report came in, he sat silently in front of the screen, rereading the discrepancies several times. In the past, mistakes like this were often handled with a phone call, an extra payment that required no explanation. Not now. Andrew had to face the consequences directly. He called a team meeting, didn't avoid responsibility, didn't blame anyone. Andrew admitted the mistake, presented a corrective plan, and proposed cuts in other areas to compensate. Some objected, some were concerned. But Andrew listened patiently, adjusted, and persuaded with logic and transparency. For the first time, my son understood what real crisis management meant, not with money, but with credibility. I followed everything from a distance. I didn't call to check in. I didn't send advice. I read the regular reports like any other board member. The numbers were no longer abstract. They carried sweat, hesitation, and nights Andrew stayed awake trying to find balance. I saw the change in his writing. Shorter, clearer, less showy. There were moments when I wanted to intervene, when I saw progress slow, when I knew Andrew was under intense pressure. But I didn't. Not because I was cold, but because I understood. If I stepped in now, everything would lose its meaning. Maturity cannot be borrowed. The project gradually moved toward completion in quiet persistence. The finished homes weren't flashy, but they were bright and solid. Natural light was used to the fullest. The spaces were small but thoughtfully arranged. Every detail was considered. Nothing excessive, nothing missing. When the first doors opened, Andrew stepped back, watching families enter cautiously, then slowly relax. A young mother held her child, eyes filling with tears, as she looked at the small but clean kitchen. A middle-aged man stood for a long time at the doorway, his hand resting on the new wooden frame, as if making sure it was real. Andrew said nothing. He simply stood there and felt it. That was the moment my son truly understood the meaning of his work. Not the approval of drawings, not the passing of a budget, but the creation of a place, a stable footing for people who had never had one. Andrew realized that in previous years he had chased the image of success, not its value. After the final handover, Andrew didn't celebrate. He came home earlier than usual, sat in his small room and opened the window to let the breeze in. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to stop. A few days later, Andrew called me. Not to report, not to seek praise, just to invite me to dinner. Simple. No restaurant, no special occasion, just a meal at his small apartment. I agreed. That evening, I stepped into a space Andrew had once been ashamed to think about. The room was still small, the furnishings still minimal, but there was a pleasant sense of order. Andrew cooked. Nothing elaborate. A simple stew, bread, boiled vegetables. The smell of food gently filled the room, bringing back memories of long-ago dinners when he was still a child. We sat across from each other. Neither of us rushed to speak. Andrew looked at me for a long time before he spoke. His voice wasn't shaking, but it was slow. He didn't ask for help. He didn't offer long explanations. Andrew apologized, not for one specific event, but for an entire period of time. He apologized for taking my sacrifices for granted, for saying things he shouldn't have said, for failing to see me as an independent person. I listened without interrupting. When Andrew finished, the room fell silent again. But this time, the silence wasn't heavy. It felt like a necessary pause after a long journey. I didn't respond with a lecture. I simply said I had been waiting for this day, not to receive an apology, but to see my son stand firmly on his own. I said that maturity always has a price, and Andrew had paid it with his own effort, without borrowing from anyone. Andrew lowered his head, not in shame, but in relief. Dinner ended simply. No grand promises, no distant plans, just two people sitting together, sharing a meal, like those who had passed through pain and learned to see each other with different eyes. And in that moment, I knew my son had truly grown up, not because of success, but because he understood its cost. Many years have passed since that Christmas season, the one when a seemingly careless sentence forced all of us to stop and look directly at ourselves. Time doesn't erase memories, but it softens their sharpest edges, so that when we look back, we can see the entire road we've traveled, not just one painful turn. The affordable housing project Andrew once presented at that fateful meeting didn't stop at the initial pilot site. It grew slowly, step by steady step, much like my son's growth. Not every proposal was approved, not every phase went smoothly, but Andrew was no longer afraid of failure as he once had been. He understood that failure isn't the collapse of an image, but part of building something lasting. I saw Andrew in new roles, not through boasting, but through concise reports, meetings where he listened more than he spoke. My son learned to ask questions before drawing conclusions, to take responsibility when mistakes occurred, and most importantly, to see people before numbers. As the project expanded into other areas, Andrew proactively proposed more transparent partnership models, prioritizing quality of life over speed. There were simple home handover ceremonies where he stood quietly to the side, letting the families receiving keys stand at the center. I once believed success needed to be seen. Now I understand that lasting success often chooses silence. I changed too. Not because I became weaker, but because I no longer needed to stand on the front line. I stepped back from daily operational decisions, allowing younger people, including Andrew, to carry the weight. I chose slower mornings, reading by the window, tending to the small garden behind my house. I still followed things, still read reports, but I didn't intervene unless asked. That wasn't letting go. It was trust. That Christmas arrived with a very different feeling. No extravagant table, no conversations about money, just a warm meal, a few relatives, soft lights, and familiar music. Andrew stood up during dinner, not to announce something grand, but to say something that had needed to be said for a long time. He spoke about his mistakes. No excuses, no detours. He said he had once confused entitlement with value, support with inevitability. Andrew said it in front of everyone, not to receive praise, but to close an old chapter with dignity. When someone mentioned making it up to me, Andrew turned and looked at me, waiting. I shook my head. I said I didn't need money. I never had. What I wanted most had arrived long ago, to see my son stand upright, leaning on no one, neither puffed up with arrogance nor bowed down by shame. Character, I said, matters more than any asset that can be passed on. Andrew stayed silent, but I knew he understood. Later, sitting alone after the gathering, watching Christmas lights reflect on the glass, I thought about the road behind us, about choices that seemed harsh, about silences that were misunderstood, about boundaries. Something I learned too late, but thankfully not too late. Love without boundaries is not love. It is avoidance disguised as sacrifice. I once believed that giving without asking would protect my child, but in the end, what truly protected him was having the courage to say enough at the right time. If there is any legacy I leave behind, it isn't houses or companies. It's the lesson that everyone must walk on their own 2 feet, and that true love always comes with respect, for others and for oneself. I don't regret it. Not because everything ended well, but because I dared to face the truth while it could still be corrected. And I know that somewhere out there are people standing before choices very much like the ones I once faced, staying silent to keep the peace or speaking up to protect something more important. If this story touched you, I would truly love to know where you're listening from. A small city, a quiet town, or a familiar room somewhere. Please leave a few lines below to share. Have you ever had to set boundaries with someone you love? If you see yourself in this story, don't hesitate to tap like, subscribe, and stay with me for the stories ahead. Thank you for your time, your listening, and for sharing your heart with this journey. Your presence means more than you think.